everyone. I call this October 2nd meeting of the James City County Planning Commission to order. Mr. Holt, would you please call the roll?
Ms. Dowdy.
Here.
Ms. Dowdy represents the Stonehouse District. Ms. Leverns.
Here.
Ms. Leverns is an at-large member. Mr. Polster.
Here.
Mr. Polster represents the Jamestown District. Mr. Schmidt, who represents the Roberts District, could not be with us this evening. Mr. O'Connor.
Here.
Mr. O'Connor is an at-large member. Mr. Kropf.
Here.
Mr. Kropf represents the Powhatan District and is this year's vice chair. Mr. Haldeman.
Here.
Mr. Haldeman represents the Berkeley District and is this year's chair. I'm Paul Holt, Director of Community Development and Planning for the county, and sitting to my left is Mr. Max Halavin, our Deputy County Attorney. Mr. Chairman, we have a quorum.
Thank you. We now have time for public comment. This is a time for the public to speak to a subject that is not part of a public hearing tonight. Speakers are limited to 3 minutes, and we'd appreciate it if you'd give us your name and address. We don't have speaker cards for this portion, but if anybody would like to address the commission, you're welcome to do so at this time. Yes, ma'am. Come up to the podium. Thank you.
My name is Sharon Dennis, and I live at 100 St. George's Boulevard. Something that had been brought to my attention years ago, and I had spoken to one of our representatives, and that was in regards to the sidewalks that kind of connect where our pathways go on Ironbound Road towards Newtown. And I don't want to make this a very long story right now, but there were conditions on my property that brought to my attention. Children particularly, had to go through my property to be safe, to get through to the other side of, the neighborhood, let's say, down Ironbound. And I didn't block that area. I left it open for them. There were some issues that came up through the neighbors back in the day that I was not happy about. But in spite of what they were doing to me personally, I left that area open so the children would be safe. But I said, if I did close that up, I was very concerned that someone's going to get killed. And I brought that to the attention of the representative, I can't remember her name now, and we actually talked about it. She met with me, and I said, someone's going to get killed. I see that road on Ironbound. It's very dangerous. People are driving 55 miles an hour from the school, and there's very deadly turns. And I wouldn't have known about this, but for that I knew the young man that actually got hit on the road and lost his arm within weeks of me citing this. Now, I don't know if there's been other incidences, because not even that one would have come to my attention had I not known about it personally. But I'm still very concerned about it. Now, I'm pretty busy. That's part of the reason I'm here. I was so busy I didn't do what I had to do for me. But it's of great concern, and I understand that we have limited resources. I understand that transportation has a say in everything, but Ironbound Road and heading towards the stores and to Newtown and towards the park, it's almost like an attractive nuisance. We developed the area, we built it up, and we certainly made roads for cars, but we didn't make it safe for those of our citizens that have the least ability. They don't have cars. So it's either those who are poor, riding bikes, need jobs, or children. And I just think it's very dangerous, and I didn't get anywhere. There was no feedback. So I guess I thought this would be an opportunity to bring it to your attention, and I'm hoping someone will consider doing something about that.
Thank you very much. Any other comments at this time? Seeing none, we'll turn to reports of the commission. The Development Review Committee, Mr. Polster, please.
The Development Review Committee met at 4 p.m. on 18 September. Committee members present were Odessa Dowdy, Jack Haldeman, Dave Schmidt, and Frank Polster. Planning staff members present were Alex Baruch, Tori Haynes, Katie Pelletier, Juan Carlos Morgado from the Stormwater, and applicants Daryl Cook from the Stormwater and Resource Protection Division from James City County, Wesley Dollins and Joe Riquet from Colonial Heritage, Len R. Ryan, Sis Stevens, AES, and Greg Davis from Kaufman and Knoll. SP 190065, Chickahominy Riverfront Park, shoreline stabilization, tree removal. A special use permit condition for Chickahominy Riverfront Park requires that tree clearing on the entire property is limited to a minimum necessary to accommodate the master plan as determined by the Director of Planning and the DRC. The applicant is requesting to remove 65 trees as part of a project to stabilize portions of the park shoreline along both the Chickahominy River and Gordon Creek that are experiencing excessive erosion. The bank erosion is reducing the existing riparian buffer as the shoreline moves inland, and the eroded banks present a safety hazard for park patrons. Mr. Darrell Cook from the Stormwater and Resource Protection Division described the various elements of the project intended to stabilize the shoreline erosion and stabilization of marshlands. Mr. Schmidt inquired on the start date and duration of the project. The plan is to start in February timeframe and finish by Memorial Day to limit the disruption to the park's operation. However, Mr. Cook added that there is a potential stipulation by the state's Marine Fisheries Commission to limit the construction timeframe to the non-spawning period of the year, which would conflict with the proposed plan. Commissioners were supportive of the tree removal, and the DRC voted 4-0 to recommend approval of SP 190065, Chickahominy Riverfront Park Shoreline Stabilization tree removal to the Director of Planning, of which we're going to hear that as an item on the consent calendar tonight. Colonial Heritage Deer Lake Estates rezoning was presented to the DRC as a conceptual plan proposing to rezone the area comprising Deer Lake Estates from A1 General Agricultural with proffers and Rural Cluster SUP to MU Mixed Use with proffers. The applicant requested the item on the DRC calendar to discuss the project and seek input and questions from the DRC members. No action by the DRC was required. The property is currently A1 Rural Cluster Low Density Residential, not age restricted, as a maximum of 50 units with its own entrance to Jolly Pond Road, and is in the PSA. The rezoning request would be for mixed use, substituting the current 50 units for 150 single-family detached from the current Colonial Heritage Master Plan of 2,000 units, age restricted, no entrance on Jolly Pond Road, with proffers, an additional 77 acres of a conservation area, and a potential 4-acre lot for a future fire station. The overall reason for the zoning change is Lennar's market analysis showing challenges with large lot development versus home buyers' preference for smaller, low-maintenance yards and single-story floor plans offered in the age-restricted community. The proposed 150 single-family detached units would have the same land disturbance as the current approved 50 units. The view shed enjoyed by current adjacent homeowners bordering Deer Lake by the dam was not to be developed. The view shed also included the proposed conservation area of 76 acres on the opposite side of Deer Lake. Mr. Schmidt suggested that the area would be ideal for recreational trails and the residents. Commissioners found no objections to the proposed rezoning of Deer Lake Estates to mixed use, like the additional 70-acre conservation area proffered to the current adjacent 282-acre conservation area, and the elimination of the Jolly Pond Road entrance. Meeting was adjourned until the regular DRC on 23 October. That concludes my report, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Any questions of Mr. Polster? Thank you. Policy Committee.
Policy Committee did not meet in September.
We'll move on to the consent agenda. There are 2 items, as you can see. Would any commissioner like to pull a topic from the consent agenda? Not, may I have a motion to approve?
Mr. Chairman, I recommend approval of the consent agenda.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. We'll move on to public hearings. Case number 1, SUP-19-0018, 6623 Richmond Road, Train Control System Assembly and Storage. Mr. Ribeiro, good evening.
Good evening, sir, and thank you, members of the Planning Commission. Mr. Joseph Stanko of Divergent Approach Incorporation, DAI, has applied for SUP to allow for the processing, assembly, and storage of light industrial products within a portion of an existing building located at 6623 Richmond Road. The site is split zone B1, General Business, and A1, General Agricultural, with the structure entirely within the B1 designation. Processing, assembly, and storage of light industrial products require a SUP in the B1 zoning district. This application proposes no additional impervious surfaces or building expansions. Operation of the business will take place in the back portion of the structure, while the existing commercial and office uses will remain at the front portion of the structure. DAI is a trained signal and communications contractor. They do not manufacture any materials. Rather, DAI assemble light industrial components from different sources to produce trained signal systems. These components include ground materials such as cables, train control loops, junction boxes, program microprocessors, and instrument shelters. Ground materials and microprocessors are purchased, stored, and shipped to installation contractors at the project sites. The instrument shelter is manufactured off-site and delivered to DAI for final assembly. The finished instrument shelter is then shipped to different clients across the country. All operation associated with this use will occur indoors. Therefore, potential impacts such as lighting, noise, dust, storage of materials will be contained within the structure. The proposal will generate a limited amount of traffic with no impact to the right-of-way. According to the applicant, the current plan for the assembly warehouse operation is 6 employees. Parking for employees and delivery vehicles is available at the rear parking area. Delivery traffic typically consists of a box truck once to twice a week, FedEx trucks daily, and a tractor trailer once a month. Staff notes that Richmond Road is designated by the comprehensive plan as a community character corridor. The proposed operation will occur indoors and at the back portion of the structure with limited visual impacts to the right-of-way. Also, a previous SOP application for an outdoor flea market located at the front parking lot area of the property has addressed landscaping along the frontage of the property. The property is designated mixed-use, light-foot area on the 2035 comprehensive plan. Principal suggested uses are moderate density housing, commercial and office development. From a use standpoint, the current proposal use is considered light industrial, which is not a principal suggested use. However, the existing structure continues to contain commercial uses, and the proposed use will also include office elements as part of the light industrial use. Given this mix for the structure overall and the fact that the proposed use has impacts that are similar or less than many retail and commercial uses, staff finds the use consistent with the comprehensive plan. Staff finds the proposal compatible with surrounding development and consistent with the recommendations of the adopted comprehensive plan. Staff recommends the Planning Commission to recommend approval of this application to the Board of Supervisors, subject to the attached conditions. At this point, I'll be happy to answer any questions the Commission may have. The applicant is also in attendance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ribeiro. Any questions?
I just had one. I remember when we had on the same piece of property for the flea market piece, as I recall, there was an objection on the part of the folks that own the land adjacent to it on the Nolan Road, right behind the bank. Some concern for crossing. Did we hear anything from?
No, sir.
Thank you.
Other questions? Leverett?
I assume the applicant took a close look at the ability of a 18-wheeler to navigate that space, and it looks kind of tight. Whether they would back in from Richmond Road, which
we'll defer that question to the applicant, but I also bring up that area of that complex, it was really designed for warehousing. So my assumption is that it's capable of handling that kind of traffic.
Any other questions? Any disclosures? Seeing none, I'll open the public hearing. Mr. Getty?
Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, I'm Vernon Getty. It's my pleasure to be here tonight representing Diverging Approach. Also here is its president, Mr. Joe Stanko. We'll be very brief. This is a little bit of an unusual case in that actually nothing new is proposed to be built. It's a change in use of the warehouse portion of this building. And I would say this is exactly the type of business you want to attract to and keep in James City County. High-tech business creates good jobs and no adverse impacts. So with that, given your long agenda, I'll be quiet. We're glad to answer any questions and would urge you to recommend approval to the board.
Any questions of the? Don't see any. Thank you. Do you have any speaker cards? Would anybody like to address the commission on this subject? Seeing none, we'll close the public hearing. Discussion? May I have a motion, please?
Approval of SUP 19-0018, 6623 Richmond Road, Train Control System Assembly and Storage.
Thank you very much. Call the roll, Mr. Holt.
To include the proposed conditions, Ms. Levens, as a, include the staff recommended SUP conditions?
Correct, yeah.
Ms. Dowdy?
Aye.
Ms. Leverins?
Aye.
Mr. Polster?
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor?
Aye.
Mr. Crop?
Aye.
And Mr. Haldeman?
Aye.
Thank you, motion carries.
Thank you. I'll move on to case number 2, SUP-19-0016, 3021 Ironbound Road Tourist Home. Ms. Costello, good evening.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission. Ms. Sharon Dennis has applied for a special use permit to allow for the operation of a tourist home at 3021 Ironbound Road. The tourist home SUP will allow for the short-term rental of a 2-bedroom home with no changes to the size or footprint of the home. The property is zoned R8, rural residential, is designated low-density residential in the comprehensive plan, and is located inside the primary service area, as all are the surrounding parcels. Staff considered the home's location, parking provisions, and screening all to be favorable factors in the evaluation of this application. The property has an existing driveway and parking area sufficient to accommodate guests and is screened from adjacent properties through fencing and vegetation. Staff is recommending conditions which are intended to mitigate the impacts of the use and preserve the residential character of the home. Such conditions include limitations on the number of rooms rented and the total number of rental occupants per stay. Staff notes that there was a previously approved special use permit for a tourist home which expired due to a condition not being met within the required time frame. Staff finds the proposal to be compatible with the 2035 Comprehensive Plan, zoning ordinance, and surrounding development, and recommends that the Planning Commission recommend approval of this application to the Board of Supervisors, subject to the conditions included in tonight's packet. At this time, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have, and the applicant is also available. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions, applicant? Any disclosures? None, I'll open the public hearing. Anything from the applicant? Do you have any speaker? Would anybody care to address the commission on this subject? Seeing none, I'll close the public hearing. Discussion? Please have a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move approval of SUP-19-0016, 3021 Ironbound Road Tourist Home and the associated conditions.
Holt, please call the roll.
Ms. Dowdy?
Aye.
Ms. Leverins?
Aye.
Mr. Polster?
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor?
Aye.
Mr. Crop?
Aye.
And Mr. Haldeman?
Aye.
Thank you, motion carries.
We are going to handle items number 3 and 4 together. AFD-19-0001 Hill Pleasant Farm 7150 Richmond Road AFD withdrawal, and SUP-19-0017 Hill Pleasant Farm Solar Farm. Mr. Leininger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission. Mr. Ben Vollmer has applied on behalf of Strata Solar for a special use permit to construct a solar farm and an AFD withdrawal to remove 192.76 acre portion of the 391.3 acre parcel within the Hill Pleasant Farm AFD. The subject parcel is one of 3 currently in the Hill Pleasant Farm AFD, which totals to 529.3 acres. The parcel is located at 7150 Richmond Road and is currently zoned A1 General Agriculture. It is designated Economic Opportunity on the 2035 Comprehensive Land Use Map and is outside the primary service area. Prior to the approval of the special use permit for the solar farm, the subject area for the SUP is required to be removed from the AFD. Outside of the AFD renewal periods, withdrawals must be approved by the Board of Supervisors according to the specific set of criteria. The AFD withdrawal was reviewed by staff and found that it only met 2 of the 4 criteria listed in the board-adopted policy governing the withdrawals of property from AFDs. Staff recommended that the AFD Advisory Committee recommend denial of the application at the July 25th, 2019 meeting. The AFD Advisory Committee voted 8-0 to recommend approval of the withdrawal request to the Planning Commission and the Board of Supervisors. Major elements of the proposed solar farm facility are the ground-mounted arrays of solar panels. Each array is made of a number of panels, and the arrays are mounted on a single axis tracker. The tracker is a device that automatically orients the arrays toward the direction of the sun. All new utilities will be placed underground, and the solar farm will connect to an existing Dominion Power utility pole. A 50-foot vegetative buffer is shown along the perimeter of the development. The buffer is increased to 75 feet for areas that are along Richmond Road. The lease will be for 30 years, but there are 2 5-year options to extend the lease. The proposed solar farm will take access from Rochambeau Drive, and construction activities such as pile driving, clearing, and grading will have limited hours per the SUP condition. The 2035 Comprehensive Land Use Map designates the property as economic opportunity. The comprehensive plan does not specifically identify solar power, or utilities in general in the economic opportunity district. Therefore, staff has reviewed this application as a transitional use for the district, given the limited lease. Please also note that Section 15.2-2232 of the Code of Virginia requires that unless a utility facility is shown on the adopted comprehensive plan or other master plan for the county, the local planning commission and governing body shall review the facility to determine whether the location, character, and extent of the project is substantial in accordance with the comprehensive plan. A resolution for consistency with the Section 15.2-2232 of the Code of Virginia is offered as attachment number 4 in the packet. Based on the evaluation of the criteria listed in the Board of Supervisors policy governing the withdrawal of properties from AFDs, staff recommends that the Planning Commission recommend denial of the AFD withdrawal application to the Board of Supervisors. Staff recommends that the Planning Commission recommend approval of the proposed SUP subject to proposed conditions and approving case AFD 19-0001 to the Board of Supervisors. Additionally, staff recommends that the Planning Commission find this application consistent with the Code of Virginia 15.2-2232. I'll be happy to answer any questions you have at this time, and the applicant is here as well and can answer any. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions, Ms. Leverance?
Just for the record, would you reiterate which of the 4 conditions the staff felt that it did not meet?
So it was the first 2. The request shall be a result of an unforeseeable change in circumstances. Traditionally, staff interpret that as a death of a property owner. And then the request needs to serve a public interest, and based on previous AFD withdrawal requests, staff interpreted that as public facilities such as schools, police stations, fire stations for the site.
Further questions?
I do. If I may just follow up a little bit, the items from the Board of Supervisors 2010 policy, in the staff report, it mentions that the policy of the Board of Supervisors is to discourage the withdrawal of properties. It didn't say prohibit the withdrawal of properties. And so my question is, does the word discourage provide a little more daylight for a staff recommendation, or does staff still feel that there's enough of a difference between the 2 items to warrant a recommendation to not approve.
So staff reviewed it and found that since only 2 of them were met, didn't feel that they completely met all of the criteria. I can't answer if they would have met 3 of the 4, what staff's recommendation would have been.
Because I also look at one of the criteria being the public use comment that, that in the report it's viewed public use is considered fire stations, police stations, schools, and that sort of thing. But, you know, I would also argue that providing electrical power into the grid for the residents could be, again, considered a public use for that particular property. And I was just interested in staff's perspective on that.
So, Mr. Crop, members of the commission, I think that's some of the flexibility that's afforded to the commission and the board in terms of their deliberations. Staff looks back at what we've done historically, and we have, I think, a much more sort of conservative view of that, and feel pretty strongly that since it did not meet all of the criteria of the board's adopted policy, we were not able to support it. But again, that's a consideration that the Planning Commission and board can take into account when they consider these items.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I ask just a procedural question, Mr. Chairman. So since we're taking both of these cases simultaneously, will we vote first on this one and then move to the next, or will everything be rolled in, such as public comment for both?
Everything, we're going to have one public hearing.
Okay.
For both. And I'm also going to give a little latitude to speakers' time limits, because normally they get 2 times 3 or 2 times 15, and so we're going to spread that out a little bit. And but to answer your question, yes, we're going to have 3 separate votes. We're going to vote for the withdrawal. We're going to vote for the comprehensive plan consistency resolution, and then we're going to vote for the SUP itself.
Okay.
All one after the other.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Good question. Thank you. No other questions, I guess? Disclosures? We'll open the public hearing.
And again, Mr. Chairman, just to be clear, you're opening the public hearing for both case numbers AFD 19-001 and SUP 19-0017.
Thank you for that clarification. You're right. Mr. Davis?
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. I'm Greg Davis, the James City County Law Offices of Kaufman and Knowles. It's my pleasure to be here tonight representing Strata Solar, the applicant in this case. I'm pausing as the control room brings up our presentation, if you'll bear with me for a moment. Thank you very much. Project team for the applications before you tonight consists of Hill Pleasant Farm. The owner, Mr. Don Hunt, is here, familiar to probably everyone in this room. Strata Solar is the applicant, the tenant of Hill Pleasant Farm for purposes of the proposed solar farm. I have with me Mr. Jackson Naftel and Mr. Ben Volmer from Strata. Also, their in-house engineer, Joe Davis, is here, and their in-house horticulturist, Katie Hill, is here to field questions if you should have them. And of course, my firm, I, along with my colleague Adam Pratt, as counsel for the application. Some background on the applicant. Strata Solar is a well-known and accomplished developer of solar projects. I pulled up and quoted a few of the accolades they've earned over time. Suffice it to say they've been recognized as the #1 solar provider in the Southeast region. They've helped make North Carolina the home state for Strata, second in the United States for installed solar capacity. Don Hunt probably needs no introduction. Don retired from farming on Hill Pleasant about 10 years ago. He's the 3rd generation there. His daughters have grown up and moved off the farm. They've indicated they won't be coming back to farming. And so the Hunt family's been looking for a buyer for 10 years. And the Moortown Road extension, which would provide critical access to the property, has not materialized. There's no foreseeable progress on that. So the road access to the site limits development, as does rail access, lack of rail access, and the existence of the railroad tracks as a barrier, and there's no large user looking for that tract of land in that location. So along came Strata Solar and began to discuss the solar farm with Don and his family, and that brings us here tonight. I'd like to address first, Mr. Chairman, the AFD withdrawal. This is a printout or an image of the master plan that you have before you showing the boundaries of Hill Pleasant Farm. Now, the portion that we seek withdrawal from the AFD on is the area below this green line. So that would be to the east, eastern portion of the property, and it's 192 acres. The black area there represents the solar array, and the area above the green line would remain in the agricultural and forestal district. The AFD withdrawal policy has the 4 elements that Mr. Leininger articulately mentioned. I think a couple of them are easy. The first element being consistency with the comprehensive plan. The staff has considered that and has come forward with regard to this use, saying yes, this transition use is consistent with the comprehensive plan. And the second key element is whether or not the withdrawal that we seek would do any damage or disrupt the Hill Pleasant agricultural and forestal district. This withdrawal leaves 337 acres in the agricultural and forestal district, well above the 200 acres required by statute. Our proposed withdrawal at 192 or so acres is appropriate. If we sought to withdraw the entire parcel, the 391 acres of Hill Pleasant Farm, that would leave the AFD without sufficient acreage to continue. Mr. Hunt's circumstances have changed. The AFD designation or district was renewed September 11th of last year. He didn't sign the lease with Strata until September 24th of last year. That wasn't any gamesmanship or fancy lawyering. That was the time at which he reached an agreement with Strata. The AFD renewal process, as you well know, began much earlier in 2018, comes through the AFD Advisory Committee, comes through your Planning Commission. And at the time that the AFD renewal came up and ultimately was approved by the board, there was no signed agreement, no agreed upon terms with Strata. And so the AFD renewal made sense to the Hunts at that time. If they had taken a chance and said, well, we won't renew the AFD on our farm in hopes that we get an agreement, family would have had rollback taxes and the increased tax bill going forward, and the prospect that there was no solar developer or any buyer for the property. And so the circumstances facing the Hunt family changed dramatically with the solar lease, but not until after the AFD was renewed. And so I'd respectfully suggest to the Commission that this meets the unforeseen circumstances test in the board's policy. And finally, there's the public policy element of the test. Does the proposed use meet a public purpose? Well, the General Assembly helps us with that because in the legislation which creates the currently very favorable environment for solar power green energy development, the Code of Virginia, amended just last year, provides that achieving renewable energy in Virginia is in the public interest, and that solar generation facilities are in the public interest. Further, this facility will provide what we refer to as green energy, clean, environmentally friendly energy to this community. This is not a proposal that comes before you to ship electricity to New York. This is energy that would be used in our county. Corporate, commercial, academic institutions that look to locate in a county are looking for existing sources of clean energy. And so I would further respectfully suggest that the existence of the solar facility at issue tonight is attractive as our county looks for those sorts of attractive users. The construction on the solar facility would be done by local contractors. I spoke with Sandy Warner as we prepared for the AFD withdrawal committee, or AFD advisory committee meeting. He was the acting county administrator in Surrey when a solar farm was built there, and again in another county, I think it was Southampton when one was built. And he was able to relate that the contractors that were used were local in those facilities, and in fact, because of the scope of the work, they had to create jobs. They hired more workers for these local contractors to meet the burdens, and there were benefits like hotel rooms and restaurant meals and an economic boost to the localities from the project. And finally, on the four-pronged test, One of the elements of the public purpose test is whether or not the public purpose could be met after the AFD expires. Well, in this case, not only is this development contingent upon fairly quick movement, but in fact, the window opened by the General Assembly, which encourages solar development with certain profitability incentives to electric utilities, that window closes before the AFD releases Hill Pleasant Farm. So this is not an opportunity that would exist for another 3 years and could be taken advantage of when next the Hill Pleasant Agricultural and Forestal District is considered. Having addressed the AFD withdrawal, Mr. Chairman, I'll turn to the special use permit. And to be honest, I considered using this as my only slide for the special use permit. This picture taken of Richmond Road looking to the west and toward the railroad tracks, Hill Pleasant Farm, of course, is across the tracks in the distance, really says it all. The grade of the railroad tracks is above the grade of the road. And as those of us who drive that road know, you can't see Hill Pleasant Farm from Richmond Road. The master plan has some, I think, illustrative drawings included with an elevation view. So over on the left is a little hypothetical car at the elevation of Richmond Road. This vantage point is westerly, closer to Jamestown Feed and Seed. And you can see that the elevation of the railroad tracks is 10 feet above Richmond Road there, and there are those that's existing vegetation beside the railroad tracks. Very effective screen. A little farther east, the elevation of the railroad tracks is 5 feet, and then closer to the car wash, the elevation of the tracks is 3 feet. But again, significant existing vegetation here, which the SUP conditions require be preserved. In addition to the topographic barriers to visibility of the proposed solar farm, the SUP conditions establish a 50-foot minimum buffer around the entire facility, and that buffer is wider at 75 feet on all of the area of the proposed solar facility that is close to Richmond Road. The entrance to the project must be from the Rochambeau roadside, no access from Richmond Road. And that will eliminate any traffic impacts. There's not much traffic impact from a solar farm after construction. Periodically, one pickup truck will go out and monitor, occasionally some mowing and plant maintenance. Plants and vegetation within the solar farm footprint and within the buffer will provide plants that are attractive to pollinators, honeybees and other pollinators. So it's the plants, they use those for cover as well as for food. We had a question from the commission prior to the hearing to provide some pictures of what these pollinator plantings or pollinator-friendly plantings would look like. These are photographs taken from a Strata Solar project in North Carolina recently. These are samples of the pollinator-friendly plants with pollinators on them. The plantings are timed so that different species flower during the entire growing season. Approximately 4.5 acres of the site would be set aside for a pollinator garden, look like the flowered areas that I've just showed you. Then inside the fenced area, or inside the array as it's called, low-growing plants, which would include a clover mix, are used as standard operating procedure by Strata. So there would be about 125 or 130 acres of a low-growing mix of turf with white clover, and white clover is considered and accepted as a pollinator insect-friendly planting. As you consider the special use permit, members of the commission, I'd ask that you recognize that a solar farm is a good holding use, like farming, but cleaner. No nutrients being applied much. No animal waste, of course, from livestock, no soil erosion, no watershed impact. And this transitional use, or holding use as I call it, prevents more intensive development during the 30 years or more that the solar farm would exist. So this takes pressure off of Hill Pleasant Farm for residential development, which would generate traffic and, of course, attenuate fiscal impacts. We project this to be a project which would generate a positive fiscal impact both from the standpoint of the jobs I mentioned earlier and tax revenue, without any burden on libraries, schools, rec centers, water, et cetera. And there are very few neighbors. We've looked at this carefully. There are only 6 properties that front on Hill Pleasant Farm. We've talked to several of them, a couple we couldn't find, but we checked carefully with staff and confirmed that there were no concerns or inquiries raised. So in summary, I would point out that the solar farm is specially permitted in the A1 district, and the SUP conditions before you, of course, are intended to protect the county and its residents from any negative impacts. We've worked hard on those conditions and respectfully suggest that they do protect the county. The staff recommends approval. The AFD Advisory Committee recommended approval unanimously, and thus I would ask that you follow those recommendations. I'd be happy to answer any questions or have the Strata staff come forward as well, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Any questions of the applicant?
Evening, Mr. Davis.
Ms. Crop?
My compliments on your presentation. I was asking some of the questions about the pollinators, and you addressed the size and scope of it very well. My compliments to Strata Solar as well. I did some research online, and they've got quite a reputation in North Carolina. North Carolina has very aggressively pursued, they've even published a guidance for native plantings on solar sites, a guidebook. But my question is, well, two questions actually. One is, will the clover or low-growing flowers be planted under the arrays as well as in the garden? I get that impression if it's going to be 125 or so acres.
Yes, sir. Under the arrays, a low-growing pollinator-friendly planting is required. These arrays move to track the sun. Mm-hmm. I'm told by Katie Hill that many of the pollinators you saw pictures of grow too high and tangle the mechanism. So the clover mix, very favorable to pollinators, would be underneath the array in that 125 acres.
And will they be using native grasses as opposed to turf grasses in some areas of the site?
Native or turf? Turf is the current proposal.
Okay.
Some consideration over the effectiveness of the clover and grass mix to quickly prevent erosion. I'm learning about this.
Okay. Because my understanding was that turf grasses require a lot more maintenance as far as mowing a number of times during the year, whereas native grasses might be only once or twice. And the article that I read cited the applicant Strata, thank you, as saying that it cut their maintenance costs in half by using native grasses.
Clover has helped as well. I understand from Ms. Hill earlier that that cuts down on the amount of mowing. Yes, sir.
My final question is, you were very specific in the presentation about the amount of land being used for pollinator-friendly plantings, but none of that, to my knowledge, translated into any of the SUP conditions.
Yes, sir.
Would the applicant be receptive to adding a level of specificity to those conditions?
Yes, sir. Okay. In response to the question, which I now learn came from you through staff, we discussed that earlier tonight, and we'd be pleased, no objection to a recommendation from the commission for approval with the addition of a SUP condition to be developed with staff afterwards that would require a clover mix, pollinator-friendly plantings within the array, within the fenced area. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
I've got a follow-on to that same line of questioning on the pollinators if I can. And so the first one is do you have a schematic showing all the fencing and the buffering areas for the project?
I do, yes, sir, Mr. Polster. I need some help from the control room to back up here.
That's a good one.
All right,
that one's
let's
fine.
try that one.
It's
This is the entire
right.
AFD, so this property up here is not part of Hill Pleasant, but this does show the extent of the array and the fencing.
So in the one schematic in the master plan area, you had a designated area, I thought, by the farmhouse for where the 5 acres of pollinators are going to be?
That's here, yes, sir.
And that's the mix of high, low, all the rest of that piece?
Yes, Mr. Polster, yes,
Okay.
sir.
Then this is also a follow-on to the buffering piece, and I'll get to the rest of the pollinator in a second. Is the first diagram you showed a line across the RPA area, And if I recall correctly, you're going to use that as a buffer on the eastern side by preserving those trees that are in the RPA. Did I misread that?
I think that's right. I think that the line withdrawn from the AFD generally follows that ravine system and has RPA in it.
And so for the length of this lease of whatever it is, 30 years or so, there'll be no harvesting of those trees that are the buffering area that are in the RPA. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that is correct. There'll
Okay.
be some harvesting of trees outside the RPA within the array here, but not in the area.
So back
you
to the
described.
SUP for the pollinator piece. When I look at the contours of that brownish area where the swales are for your BMPs, is there any thought about putting pollinators that are more than the size of the clover, which is what, almost a half an inch to a foot in height? And I understand why you wouldn't want that under the terrain, but is there any reason why you wouldn't want to put pollinators along all that brown area, and not just because of the 5 acres there? Is there a reason for that?
Right person to address that. Is that engineering? Come on up, Joe. Joe Davis from Strata.
Joe Davis, civil engineer, Strata. One of your questions, that hatch that goes around the entire site there represents trees to remain, 50 foot to remain. Around
Those are the
extent of
trees
site.
not in the RPA, so the
Right,
RPA,
some of them are within the RPA and some are outside the RPA, but the intent was to show that the entire site will be still surrounded by a minimum of 50 foot.
those little black boxes that you have in that area are the proposed BMPs for drainage on there.
Yeah, so we thought about the idea of using the pollinators outside the fence, but what we're concerned with is that those are typically the steepest areas, the most vulnerable to erosion. And these native plantings and the pollinators tend to be slower establishing, and the thing we really want to avoid is erosion at the end of the project. So we would like to stick with the turf mix in those areas, just for the,
If I understand your seeding plan that you had for both your pollinators and for your clover, you've got periods of time that you're doing it on an annual basis for both the spring and for the summer period. So after you've got the erosion under control in those contours, couldn't you, in preceding years, put the type of pollinators in there now that you've got that ground under control?
it could be a possibility. My understanding is generally for the assured success of them, it kind of requires that you eradicate the existing vegetation so that it's not choked out by the turf. And I think that would leave us very vulnerable to erosion in those areas. So we've been going through this recently on some other projects where it's wholesale, the entire project shall be native grasses. And we've been raising this concern with DEQ as well, that we would like to kind of temper that and make sure that we're able to adequately stabilize the site. And
I understand that.
So that's our concern with that. And that's why we decided to use this area that is formerly a farm field and is on a fairly flat area and try to help
Okay,
provide.
the last
pollinators.
question I have
Sure.
is that you have an SUP condition that says at the end of the project, you're going to take all your stuff away, da-da-da-da, and then restore the habitat. And of course, that's something you work out with the planning commission, or not the planning commission, but the planning director as to what the details of it. So just for my own information, how would you restore the habitat?
I think part of the benefit of the clover is that, and I'm not a horticulturist, Katie should, I've learned everything from her. So part of it is the clover is a nitrogen fixer, restores nitrogen to the soil.
Right.
That would help, but we would also still have to remove our equipment, but that's all.
And I'm thinking about when you go in there to remove it all, you're going to trample that all back up
Right, well-
and destroy it. And so what I'm concerned about is.
I'm sure we would probably need an erosion control plan in order to do that work, and we'd have to restabilize the site.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
My question has to do with useful life. Presumably, the technology is evolving. Is the life expectancy of these arrays 40 years? Will they need to have significant components replaced? And/or is at the end of 40 years, say they've got both 5-year extensions, would they all need to be replaced because they're outdated if it was determined that this was something that would continue?
Jackson Naftel from Strata.
Hi. So there's several components to the solar project. The primary one being the modules or the solar panels. Those are warranted anywhere from 20 to 30 years, depending on the manufacturer. And even after the end of that, let's say 25-year life, they're still performing at a very high percentage of their original capacity. What you'll find is that you will have to replace components throughout the life cycle of a solar facility, but it's not like one single overhaul where you have to go dig everything up and replace it. You'll replace it piecemeal throughout the life of the project.
And it's the arrays, it's not the moving parts underneath usually
Correct.
that have to be replaced.
Correct.
But presumably in 30 to 40 years, the technology will have evolved to such a point that perhaps major overhaul would be necessary if in fact.
It might
this was
be
something that
economically
continued.
beneficial to do that overhaul, yes. There's a good chance that 40 years from now, we're going to Mr. Hunt and asking him to renew his lease and coming to y'all again, asking him to renew this permit.
Thank you.
Hope I'm here to represent you, Jackson.
Ditto.
I can assure you I won't. Any other questions?
Good evening, Mr. Davis. How are you?
Mr. O'Connor?
Just understanding that this parcel was the first that was designated EO some years ago, and part of the discussion about the Moortown Road extension has taken place over the years. Is there anything in either the lease agreement or the design that provides for that consideration? So if the Moortown Road extension were ever to be designed and funded, is there a way for the arrays to be split, understanding that the three plans that were discussed prior go right through Mr. Hunt's property?
There's not, Mr. O'Connor. It's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation, and I've had some conversations with county officials preparatory to tonight. It's clear that neither the state nor the county can or would fund the construction of a road just to make a certain piece of property or area attractive in this part of the county. And so the construction of the road would necessarily be funded by a user, a big project that came in and acquired Hill Pleasant and maybe other lands adjacent in the EO district, and that then some or all of that road cost would be funded by that user, that development. We've had 10 years of no interest from that sort of developer, and that's what's really driven Mr. Hunt to look at options that are more creative like this. So the pessimism about the prospects of Moortown Road, or maybe realism, have led my client Strata not to accommodate a road corridor through the array.
Other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any disclosures? And we'll open the public hearings. A reminder, this is a hearing for both AFD-19-0001 and SUP-19-0017. Had the applicant's presentation. Questions, any speakers' cards? We have no speaker cards. Would anybody like to address the commission on this one issue? Seeing none, we'll close the public hearing. Discussion.
I'll kick it off, Mr. Chairman. I'm supportive of the AFD withdrawal. I looked at the 4 criteria, and as you can tell from my questioning, I do feel that the Board of Supervisor policy is almost 10 years old on AFD withdrawals, and it's not a clear prohibition, it's a discouragement of withdrawals. I do feel that the use as a solar farm does meet a public good, And I think also it's a case where this is a small step that we as a community can take to help reduce a carbon footprint. And to me, this is a very appropriate use for the land. And so as a result, and I also think this is supportive of a number of county initiatives, the Rural Economic Development Committee report trying to discourage residential uses of rural lands and so on and so forth. So I am supportive of the AFD withdrawal request. And I assume we'll do these one at a time, is that, okay? And
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I also agree with that. I'm very supportive of that, very excited about the option for citizens to have that option for renewable energy. It'll be a big step for James City County.
Further discussion?
Likewise, I think this is a precedent that is a good precedent. I think the location of this proposal is a good one because of the view shed from Route 60 will not be in the least bit affected. So I think there are a lot of things in favor. And in light of the legislative changes up in Richmond, I think it's appropriate for us to say that it does meet at least 3 of the 4, and perhaps the first, even if you this agreement was not signed until after the I would be inclined to support this as well.
Thank you very much. Further discussion?
I suspect I'm the contrarian this evening. I do believe that this is not consistent with our comprehensive plan. Again, I think we will continue to see pressure inward in the county for development and the like. And if this were a shorter term lease, I would probably be leaning more towards it, but understanding that we'd be removing this parcel for 40 years seems to me, be possible negative impact on our comprehensive plan. Maybe with the current update that we're pursuing, that might change my mind. But currently, with our 2035 comp plan, I'm just not finding this to be consistent. I also, if I go back to look at the first circumstance for an AFD, it says it could not have been anticipated, but certainly there were discussions going on, so I think it could have been anticipated. So again, I just don't think it meets all the criteria of the AFD withdrawal and isn't consistent with our 2035 comp plan.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion?
question, procedural of staff. If, for example, the AFD withdrawal is approved and the SUP is subsequently disapproved for whatever reason, does the property revert back to the AFD? Or would that require a separate legislative action?
No, that would have to be resolved before it was acted upon by the Board of Supervisors.
Question. Further discussion? If not, may I please have a motion?
Chairman, I move to approve the AFD withdrawal request, and I don't have the number handy, right?
It is AFD-19-0001. Mr. Holt, please call the roll.
Thank you very much. And again, specifically, this is for the applicant's request to only withdraw the property from the AFD. Ms. Dowdy?
Aye.
Ms. Leverins?
Aye.
Mr. Polster?
No.
Mr. O'Connor?
No.
Mr. Crop?
Aye.
And Mr. Haldeman?
Aye.
Thank you, motion.
Any discussion on the resolution for comp plan consistency?
Again, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, just for sake of clarity, the piece that is next here on the order of actions would be the resolution found in your agenda packets. There's not a case number associated with it. The SUP number is on there by reference, but this is a procedural piece required by state code, and the question before the commission is whether or not you find that the general or approximate location, character, and extent of this proposed use as a public utility is substantially in accordance with the adopted comprehensive plan.
Any discussion here?
Mr. Chairman, I'll motion approval that it is substantively in accordance with the comprehensive plan.
Vote, please call the roll.
Ms. Dowdy,
Aye.
Ms. Leverins,
Aye.
Mr. Polster,
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor,
No.
Mr. Crop,
Aye.
and Mr. Haldeman.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
We move now to the Hill Pleasant Farm, Solar Farm, SUP-19-0017. Any discussion on this matter? May I please have a motion?
I'll go for three in a row, Mr. Chairman. Motion to approve SUP 19-0017 for Hill Pleasant Farm Solar Farm with the associated conditions and the additional agreement the applicant made to work with staff and craft an additional condition dealing with the pollinators.
Can staff get and just so we have clarity for the minutes in the record, Mr. Crop, could you add a little bit more clarity about what the expectation is or what the specific condition is you're proposing to be added? If you want, I just took some generic notes, or you can go from.
Well, I was thinking from the applicant's presentation, the commitment to 4.5 acres or whatever that figure was for the pollinator plantings, the 125 to 130 acres for low-growing clover, and then any other level of detail. Obviously, I'm looking for as much detail as we can put into a condition that would guarantee that pollinator plantings are part of the conditions. And, you know, I know the applicant stipulated height in some areas, there's clover in some areas, there's the flowers in the other. But I think, looking at Mr. Davis's presentation, we can get most of the wording that we would need for that condition out of the presentation.
And that the details of that would be subject to planning director approval at the time of site plan?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Can I add, Mr. Kraft,
Sure.
the idea that the annual seeding over the 30 years for both different years so that the thing is sustained over the entire be included in there. And they have that planning schedule on their master plan diagram 4.
I have no problem with adding
That
that.
it would be established such that that would be maintained over the life cycle of the lease
Exactly.
term?
Does the applicant agree?
Clarifications, please, sir. The 125 acres would be a clover grass mix, not completely clover. And secondly, if you would allow us to have that maintenance worked out in a condition with staff, because some of those pollinator-friendly plants don't require annual planting or maintenance.
I'm just taking what you had in your diagram, and you specified spring and summer for reseeding in there. If I misread that, fine, but I didn't. Is that the case?
They're whispering in my ear that not all of the plantings require an annual seeding.
I like the idea of the re-needed then. I misunderstood that the reason of the cool and warm piece for depending upon the year. But the maintenance of it across the 40-year, 30-year time frame is what I'm concerned about, making sure that it's stipulated.
And whatever those details are, they
Right.
would come in as part of the development proposal and the plan approval.
Completely agreeable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With those conditions,
I'll just
ready to
ask,
call
is
the roll,
everybody
right?
clear on the motion? I will try to reread it if you make me. but- Okay. All right. There's a motion on the floor. Ms. Dowdy,
Aye.
Ms. Leverins,
Aye.
Mr. Polster,
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor, Mr. Crop,
Aye.
and Mr. Haldeman.
aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Thank you very much. We've been here for a while. Would anybody like to take a brief rest or see 5 minutes, 5-minute recess? We're moving on to case number Z-18-0002, Z-19-0010, and MP-18-0002, Stonehouse Plan Community Rezoning and Proffer and Master Plan Amendments. Ms. Cook.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the Commission. On behalf of the current development group within the Stonehouse Planned Unit Development, Mr. Tim Trant has submitted applications to achieve several legislative actions. First, a rezoning application has been submitted to rezone approximately 2,659 acres of land from Planned Unit Development, PUD, to A1 General Agricultural. The new A1 area would consist of two sub-areas shown on the master plan as the Stonehouse Preserve and the Riverfront Preserve. The application seeks to allow some flexibility in future use of this area, while also putting in place parameters through two restricted use easements that would be granted to the county. Through the easements in the master plan, up to 4 residential units would be allowed in the Riverfront Preserve, and up to 15 residential units, and a maximum of 130,000 square feet of commercial uses would be allowed in the Stonehouse Preserve. With regard to utilities, this property is currently inside the PSA, and the development of 19 lots would require extension of public utilities. However, should the PSA status change in the future, the requirement for a central water system might be triggered. The applicant has proceeded with submitting a central water system waiver request concurrent with this rezoning, which, if approved, would allow the future lots to be served by individual private wells. In addition, the parcels would be served by individual on-site sewage disposal systems. The second set of legislative actions are changes to the 2008 Master Plan and proffers that are comprehensive in nature, substantially revising both. Proposed changes to the Master Plan include a change in the zoning designation of approximately 735 acres from PUD commercial with proffers to PUD residential with proffers. A reduction in both the proposed overall residential unit number and the amount of commercial square footage as compared to the 2008 Master Plan, reflective of the reduction in size of the PUD overall. The new master plan will allow for up to 2,392 residential units and up to 740,000 square feet of non-residential within the PUD. There are also many changes in the development concept as outlined in detail in the staff report. One of the larger changes would be that the areas planned for commercial, office, and industrial uses along Fieldstone Parkway and Mount Laurel Road north of I-64 would now be used primarily for residential units, with a commercial component concentrated in the planned Preservation Square focal point in Track 10B. Another of the larger changes would be the relocation of the school site from an internal area along 6 Mount Zion Road to Track 9, which fronts on Rochambeau Road. With regard to the road network shown on the master plan, one of the largest changes is the elimination of the major new roadway that would have started at Rochambeau Drive, crossed over I-64, and served as the major access road for the eastern and northern portions of Stonehouse. The public impact section of the staff report provides detailed information about impacts of the proposed development, along with a comparison of the existing proffers and the proposed proffers. With regard to transportation, with the downzoning to A1 and the concurrent significant reduction in development potential, a number of the proffered transportation improvements that were originally envisioned to serve this area are now proposed to be eliminated, including the new internal parkway and a set of improvements planned to Rochambeau Drive, Croker Road, and the Croker I-64 interchange. The applicant has submitted an updated traffic study to demonstrate that adequate levels of service can be maintained under this scenario, and VDOT and the county's traffic consultant, Kimley Horn and Associates, have concurred with the proposed changes. The improvements that continue to be proffered are generally located at the existing development entrance and exit points, the Route 30 I-64 interchange, and the internal roadway intersections. The applicant has also continued to commit to exploring disconnection of Ware Creek Road west of its intersection with Mount Laurel Road, which is internal to the land owned by Stonehouse, or putting in place other measures to discourage Stonehouse traffic from using this rural roadway. For the area proposed to be zoned A1, access to and from this area would be directly onto Sycamore Landing and Croker Road or Ware Creek Road. The updated traffic study submitted by the applicant indicates that compared to the estimated existing volumes on Croker Road in 2017, the proposed development is anticipated to increase the volume by only 3%. No improvements have been proposed in the restricted use easements or proffers. With regard to public schools, as already noted, the applicant proposes a different school site to accommodate one school in Tract 9. The past use of this proposed site has led to the applicant proffering to adhere to a detailed procedure that would allow for the site to be conveyed to the county without any unusual site development, foundation, or environmental requirements. Should the site conditions determined during this procedure indicate that the site is not suitable for a school, then the applicant has proffered to provide cash in lieu. The proposed proffers also include a per unit and a lump sum cash contribution for the schools. Overall, the proposed proffers would equate to either one prepared and graded school site and up to approximately $6.95 million, or with the cash in lieu scenario, no physical school sites and up to approximately $7.79 million. Moving from public impacts to the comprehensive plan, the main portion of Stonehouse is designated as low-density residential, LDR, and mixed use, with a very small portion of Tract 9 designated rural lands. The overall density remains within the recommended range for LDR. With regard to the mixed-use area, the further development of the Stonehouse Commerce Park and the Commercial Preservation Square area are most consistent with the mixed-use description language, as are many of the commitments in the proffers to certain design, environmental protection, and access standards. The residential development shifted into Tract 11 does replace planned industrial and commercial uses, which is less consistent with the description. Staff finds the proposed amended master plan to be consistent with the LDR land use designation and generally consistent with the mixed-use land use designation. The approximately 2,659 acres proposed to be rezoned from PUD to A1 is designated LDR. Overall, this proposal achieves certain goals consistent with the comprehensive plan overall and with certain LDR development standards, and reduces the demand for and impact on public services and facilities. As a downzoning from PUD to A1, the proposed density is significantly less than that recommended by LDR. Staff recommends that the Planning Commission recommend approval of the PUD proffer and master plan amendments and acceptance of the voluntary proffers. Staff recommends that the Planning Commission recommend approval of the PUD to A1 rezoning and acceptance of the restricted use easements. I will be happy to answer any questions you may have, and the applicant is also present.
Any questions, Ms. Cook?
Just one clarification, and it's probably in the report, but I couldn't pick it out right off the bat. I'm looking at Sycamore Landing and Croker Roads. I understand that the residential component that is going into that area, the 19 homes, would produce a sufficient volume of traffic that would accommodate those two small roads. But my question is, are there going to be prohibitions, for example, if the Commonwealth comes in and uses some of that land for some purpose, or if there are logging operations or anything like that? Will there be restrictions on the ability to get into Stonehouse using those smaller roads?
If the state were to own the property, okay, so in that instance, they would still be subject to the restricted use easements. Those would still be binding.
Okay.
They would not be subject to local zoning. So the restricted use easements do include access restrictions, so where that can occur.
Okay, so that those smaller roads and windy roads will not be overburdened with heavy industrial type traffic.
And one clarification there too, the Riverfront Preserve area does not include an allowance for like silviculture or agriculture uses. It is just the residential uses allowed there.
Thank you.
Other questions? I have one. The central well waiver request, is that part of this, or is that a separate consideration?
That is a request that would be acted upon by the JCSA General Manager and in consultation with the Board of Supervisors, but is provided as information to you all.
Okay, that's not part of our vote, though. Thank you. Other question? Any disclosures?
Mr. Chairman, I had a conversation with Mr. Trant on the telephone today.
Mr. Trant and I did discuss the application.
I had a conversation with him as well.
As did I.
As did I. Mr. Trant's been a busy man.
And I.
Okay. Doing his job. We'll open the public hearing. Hear from the applicant.
Mr. Commissioner, members of the commission. My name is Art Michelle. I'm a member of the Stonehouse Glen community.
Oh,
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Hi.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. My name is Tim Trant, attorney with the law firm of Kaufman & Knowles, 4801 Courthouse Street here in James City County. It's my privilege to be here tonight on behalf of the applicant. Also with me tonight, representing the applicant team, is Mr. Jody Lane, in from Dallas, Texas, one of the owners of the project. Mr. Mike Etchemendy, who may be well known to many of you. He's the development manager and boots on the ground day-to-day for this project. And then last but not least is my colleague at Kaufman & Knowles, Laura Hoey, who's certainly the brains of my operation. So I'd like to start first by thanking Ms. Cook for her efforts on this application. As you all probably are painfully aware at this point, the Stonehouse project is a massive project, and it's got an extensive history associated with it. And candidly, as a project team, I underestimated the detail that would be required to accomplish the master plan amendment concept that's before you tonight. We thought it would be downzoning 2,600 acres. That's simple, right? You know, I've never filed a downzoning application before. Candidly, it was a little uncomfortable, but I'm excited to be a part of it. But the short of that, in all seriousness, is without the patience and diligence that Ms. Cook put into the review, the application would not be in the form it's in tonight. I'm grateful to her personally and professionally for her work with us on that. The ownership is a joint venture between Silvercap Partners based in Charlotte, North Carolina, and JTL Capital based in Dallas, Texas. They purchased the remaining undeveloped acreage comprising the Stonehouse Plan Unit development back in 2016 from the previous developer. And since that time, they've been working diligently to plan for the success and vibrancy of the future phases of Stonehouse. Not long after acquiring the property, the ownership was approached by a state agency about an interest in acquiring a large chunk of the property, the undeveloped area, in excess of 2,500 acres, to be used as a wildlife management area. The agency saw the additional 2,500 acres as a very desirable complement to the existing 2,700 acre Ware Creek Wildlife Management Area across Ware Creek in New Kent County. It was on the opposite side of Ware Creek from Stonehouse. It was purchased by the Commonwealth in that same year, in 2016. I will confess that the ownership and I were initially pretty skeptical about the feasibility of selling over half the acreage. They had just invested many millions, borrowed many more millions to purchase the property with the intent of developing it in accordance with the approved plan to recoup that investment. And regardless, given wiser minds in the ownership team, the state was a credible buyer, and they carefully and thoughtfully analyzed the proposal relative to their long-term vision and objectives for the project. And they determined, no surprise, that it would not produce the same economic result that the development program that they had envisioned would. But they did come to the realization that a transaction like that would reduce the timeline of the investment and, in turn, some of the risk associated with the investment in a way that would probably lead to a reasonably acceptable alternative development strategy. And with that, they commissioned the owner or the project team to proceed with the analysis of and the planning for such transaction. The first conclusion that we reached was it would require rezoning. And that presented a significant challenge because the ownership was reluctant to invest in a significant zoning effort, both in time and resources, in the hopes that at the end of the day, the state would be around to purchase the 2,700 acres they had just downzoned. and I represented the landowner in the disposition of their property for facilitating the Ware Creek Wildlife Management Area. And for those of you who are not familiar with how the state purchases property in these situations, they typically do not enter into a contract until they're pretty certain they're going to buy it and ready to close. And even then, they will preserve an out under the contract right up until closing, contingent upon gubernatorial approval. So that presented a significant challenge, a significant risk that the ownership would have to overcome. And many owners, I might suggest, would have backed away from the concept at that point. But the current ownership said, no, look, let's see if there's an alternative to disposition strategy that would be consistent with the downzoning and produce a similar economic result. And they charged Mike and the engineers and land planners and myself with looking at, if we get to the end, we've invested in this process, we do not have the state there to take the Stonehouse Preserve, the largest chunk of the two preserves, what would be an alternative disposition scenario that would achieve a reasonably similar economic result. At that point, we began our land planning effort and identified three primary stakeholder groups, one of which was the Mill Pond residents, the residents of the Mill Pond area or section of Stonehouse, the phase one of Stonehouse, it is often called. The other, the residents of Stonehouse Glen. And last but certainly not least would be the residents of Sycamore Landing, Croker, Ware Creek, and Mount Laurel Roads. We met several times, both in small groups, but also it had hosted a couple of community meetings prior to filing the applications to get input and feedback from those stakeholders. Some of the residents, particularly of Sycamore Landing, some of whom are here tonight, were instrumental in shaping the application. We candidly had envisioned, for example, a much greater density, residual density on the Riverfront Preserve parcel in particular. That was a key piece of the economics of this downzoning. And it was crystal clear to us very early on that that would be highly inflammatory and not a good idea. So we ultimately dropped it to the 4 home sites and eliminated commercial business uses on that property through the easements. They are also in part responsible for us utilizing easements as opposed to proffers. They were astute enough to recognize that with the state being a potential end user of a portion of the property, that they would be exempt from county zoning, and wanted to ensure that there would be some mechanism to hold an end user like that to the standards that were approved by the board in connection with the downzoning. There were some of the residents in Stonehouse Glen were very interested in what would happen across the street from them. It's currently designated on that track 10B to be over 700,000 square feet of office, retail, warehousing, and light industrial uses. We focused on a town square. Some of the residents of the Mill Pond Association, they were very interested in what was going to happen to the residual undeveloped parcels that are in the vicinity of their neighborhood, as well as the golf course, and we were able to reach agreement with them on how to address those concerns. And in any event, we, as you can see, we created from that input the application that's before you and the master plans before you, and filed that almost a year ago, a little over a year ago at this point. Talk briefly about highlights of the plan. I think the plan can be sort of summarized and practically into 4 key elements. One is the downzoning of more than 2,600 acres to A1 with restricted use easements, a reduction in approximately 1,179 dwelling units, based on my calculations, some better land planning, and the establishment of a second front door and community focal point. Try to cover these changes as they relate to the PUD first. We identified I-64 as the appropriate demarcation between light industrial and residential uses. Current master plan, as I mentioned, contemplates 2.5 million square feet of light industrial, warehousing, office, and retail uses across tracts. And I'll go to a map here to show. Across tracts 10A, 10B, 11A, and 11B. And that presents a pretty significant conflict in land uses and the associated impacts, particularly with the adjacent residential areas. Imagining heavy truck traffic on Fieldstone Parkway and 6 Mount Zion Road alone is sufficient to illustrate the problem in land planning. Such uses we feel are better situated on better accessible properties. The Hazelwood property in particular that straddles the Barhamsville interchange and is comprehensively planned for such uses. Instead, as I mentioned earlier, for Tract 10B, we envisioned a front door of sorts in a neighborhood, town square, so to speak, which is currently absent from the master plan. This is a rendering of what that might look like. It consists of a mix of neighborhood, commercial uses, residents, and a community and recreation spaces, and the trailhead to extensive trail network. With regard to the preserve parcels, the Riverfront Preserve is currently permitted. This is the portion, the 350 acres, this area at the end of Sycamore Landing Road. Currently permitted for up to 400 apartments and a marina. It has been reduced to no more than 4 home sites and no other business uses than the creation of environmental mitigation credits, which is a pretty innocuous use. Stonehouse Preserve, which this area here, 100 acres in this vicinity. Permitted currently for over 2,500 homes, and that would be reduced to 15 homes, sites, and 130,000 square feet of A1 business uses, which are extremely limited in their potential impacts. We are aware that some of the residents of Sycamore Landing Road have expressed concerns about the traffic impacts associated with such A1 business uses as we've permitted. But those uses, any uses that would present a material impact on traffic would, in our view, require a special use permit, which, as you know, special use permit process entails a traffic study, the evaluation of traffic impacts, and the mitigation of those impacts if they hope to be successful. For example, a winery with retail sale of wine is permitted as by right as an A1 business use, but ancillary commercial activities such as hosting of events, weddings, having a restaurant is not. That would require a special use permit. Similarly, a riding stable is permitted as a by right use with a business use in the A1 zone, which would allow people to board horses and take riding lessons. But in order to host events and horse shows and things of that nature that would generate the traffic concerns that have been articulated to us, those are specially permitted uses and require a special use permit. We've been asked by at least one of the residents to eliminate all commercial activity in the Stonehouse Preserve parcels. And we have a number of concerns with that, but 2 primary concerns, one being that preserving the opportunity for limited agricultural business uses is critical to the economic viability of the downzone. I mean, we cannot absorb the economic risk of the downzoning based on a residual use of just 19 homes. It's not, our risk tolerance just doesn't permit that proposal. Secondly, to do so would, I think, be inconsistent with the sustainability of rural lands over the long term. As the county has discovered, certainly through its rural lands economic development initiatives, we cannot continue to rely on private wealth to sustain our rural lands. Without some measure of economic viability, eventually the burdens of mortgages, taxes, and insurance will put pressure on the sustainability of preservation efforts. And last but not least, I will mention that we utilized easements, as we talked about, as opposed to proffers, to require compliance with the conservation intent regardless of the ownership. and to require, specifically reference compliance with the A1 zoning ordinance to impose indirectly through private property rights the zoning on a public body that would be exempt. And the reduction in the water demand associated with the downzoning results in approximately 280 million gallons annually in reduced. So with that, I will conclude my remarks and answer any questions that you have.
Questions for?
Could you elaborate a little bit more, Mr. Trent, on talking about the Stonehouse Preserve that the Commonwealth is interested in purchasing, and the fact that the restrictive easements would go along with that purpose, or with that purchase? So they would be legally bound to only putting those uses allowed by the current James City County ordinance for A1 properties? Is that correct?
That is correct. And just to elaborate briefly, so that there's no confusion, what we have proposed and prepared for county review and consideration are two separate easements, because they're two different preserve areas with different restrictions on them. But for the Stonehouse Preserve in particular, we proposed an easement that would limit the uses that can happen on the property to only those that are permitted within the A1 ordinance, and further restricted by intensity. So, for example, only 15 homes can be built in the Stonehouse Preserve, no more than 130,000 square feet of A1 business uses. If you're going to conduct silviculture, for example, you have to do it in accordance with a best management plan. Same thing for agricultural and those things. So any end user of that property would be bound by the terms of that easement. It would be a private property right that the ownership would convey to the county in connection with the rezoning, and that would be binding on any successors and titles of future owners, to include the state.
That was my next question. The easements convey with the property no matter who owns it. And right now the Commonwealth is looking at augmenting its Ware Creek Wildlife Preserve, wildlife management area with the Stonehouse Reserve. But even if they change their mind, the easement limits them to how much flexibility they would have.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
I could follow up on that. That easement applies to the state as well, because previously I thought I heard that zoning does not, the state does not have to abide by zoning.
That is correct. The state is generally exempt from local zoning ordinances, but they would be bound by a private property right such as an easement. A contractual, it's a form of contract that would be binding on the successor and any successor entitled, to include the state.
Questions?
I have, Mr. Chairman, I do have a couple more questions. Is it my understanding that future residential homes would not be permitted to even apply for wells for irrigation purposes? Is that correct?
Are we speaking within the planned unit development or the A1 area?
Well, that's what I'm seeking clarification for, because I understand that within the A1 area they could apply for a well, but could that also be, could that also be used for irrigation? I mean, who would know?
So two things. I guess I'll address the PUD first. For residences within the planned unit development, the short answer is I don't know. I know we have proffered water conservation measures and a commitment to entering into water conservation agreements with the JCSA in connection with our development planning, and I believe there are already agreements in place that prescribe what the water conservation measures or plan is for Stonehouse. I don't know off the top of my head whether they prohibit irrigation wells. Do you? Max may know the answer to that.
There is an existing water conservation agreement for the Stonehouse development. It's been amended a couple of times, and it's in place for both commercial and residential uses. And I believe the latest iteration of that does prohibit irrigation within the residential uses in the Stonehouse PUD.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Now, when it comes to A1, I understand that waivers can be applied for non-residential enterprises.
Correct. So,
Give me some examples of how that might apply.
Right. No, good question. So we are working through with staff and JCSA now sort of the conditions of what would be a well waiver or a central water system waiver that would allow for private wells, individual wells. It would be infeasible to have 19 homes on a central well system in that area. So what we have been looking at is to allow, obviously the only way homes or A1 businesses, agricultural businesses, will be able to get water in the Stonehouse Preserve or the Riverfront Preserve would be through private wells. There will be no public water supply to those facilities. So there is an allowance for, there's general agreement that they would be allowed to have private wells for residential uses and A1 business uses. We have committed, and probably speaking to your concern, JCSA was generally comfortable with the concept. There's overall reduction in public water demand as a result of this downzoning, but leaving it unaddressed as to what that water demand might look like for commercial uses was of a concern to them. And we were able to, I think, reach a tentative agreement on capping the water demand associated with commercial uses, the A1 business uses, to a 50,000 gallon per, on average, 50,000 gallon per day average over the course of a year. So
That would go for whatever the business uses plus irrigation if they chose to irrigate.
that is correct. So a winery that chose to irrigate would be subject to that cap. A horse stable.
But that's a cumulative impact. That's not per business.
That's correct. That's a cumulative impact that each user would have to
Negotiate with the others. And
Right. I mean, when we would convey the property, and that's part of what we've been working out with the county attorney's office and JCSA, is what will be the mechanism in place, how will that well waiver be established in such a way in the title to the property that allocates the amount of water usage of that 50,000 gallons per day that each business would be allowed to use. And so we would, similar to the development rights for residences, we've proposed as the master developer to allocate those rights, water rights, groundwater withdrawal rights, gallons per day, and residential density based at each sale in connection with doing the subdivisions.
now, if the state were to take over this property, does limitations still apply?
Good question. We're in the well waiver arena, and welcome any help you all can
Which
offer,
is a
Mr. Halavin.
function of the subdivision ordinance, so probably not unless it was in the easement, but I'll defer to Max.
I can't. Oh, there we go. It's on. Okay. So Paul's correct. The central well waiver is a condition on a major subdivision. So it would really depend on what the state's use was going to be. If they were using it for a public use, I don't believe that central well waiver condition would require any limitation. But if they ended up selling it to somebody else, then that would still be in place.
Okay, that's helpful.
And I apologize, Tim, for interrupting. I did look up the conservation agreement. I misspoke. There, for the non-residential uses in the PUD, there is no irrigation. There are a number of limitations on residential irrigation within the PUD, but it is allowed within certain square footage limitations and gallon per minute limitations.
Okay, all right, thanks. And then I have another question, and I hope you had a moment to prepare for this, because I know you got last-minute notification. I'm very confused about how the community association system will work. Mention of excluding the Mill Pond area. There are at least 2 associations that already exist, and then there could be 1 or more associations created, and I'm concerned partly about access to the community amenities and also who's going to pay for them.
Very good question, and it is confusing. I'm a little more prepared on that question, just as I've been dealing with it for quite some time. So there are actually 3 associations, sort of primary associations within Stonehouse. And the first I will mention is what I referred to earlier. It's the association at Stonehouse, commonly referred to as the Mill Pond Owners Association. And that is the Master Homeowners Association for the areas predominantly in gray here, the first phase of Stonehouse to be developed. These areas, the areas surrounding the golf course. There is a second homeowners association, separate and distinct, that is affiliated with and serves as the master association for all of the remaining residential development that occurs. It's the master association for the Stonehouse Glen neighborhood, which is here in gray, Land Bay 5, and all of the residual, the residual PUD areas. It would not encumber it would not serve the areas within the preserve parcels, but all of the residual PUD areas. So there'd be one master association. It is called Stonehouse Owners Foundation. It's in existence today. There may be, you are correct, a number of sub-associations. So it may be a good association planning for an individual neighborhood to have a sub-association. For example, you may have a neighborhood of townhomes that has unique common maintenance requirements. They have yard areas that are maintained in common, roof areas that are maintained in common. They're not single-family detached dwellings where that kind of maintenance is left to the individual homeowner. And so it might be appropriate to help manage those maintenance needs to have a sub-association, but they would fall under the master association, Stonehouse Owners Foundation, which will ultimately control all of the amenities within all of the community amenities, the private amenities within the association. And then there is a third association which is associated with the Commerce Park. It's a business park association.
So the members of the community association, Phase 1, are not part of so they're not responsible for paying for or have access to the amenities that are included in the current plan?
That's correct.
And vice versa?
Yes, ma'am, that is correct. There is some cost sharing associated with the common entrance drive, Fieldstone Parkway, and it's very attractive signage and landscaping there that's not cheap to maintain. So there is some cost sharing for that feature alone, but that is the only relationship, between the two associations going forward.
Very helpful, thank you.
Questions?
I got a few. Good evening, Mr. Trent. How are you? A couple of questions. What's the average market value of homes in Stonehouse Glen now? Do you know?
I don't know the answer to that question.
I'm asking because I see that you've reduced the number of homes to comply with the housing opportunity policy from 125 to 85, just keeping it roughly 3.5% of the homes. Just curious, I'm of the opinion that putting workforce and affordable housing in a PUD is always successful. I don't know what the monthly are and doesn't always make it affordable long term. So especially with some of the maintenance requirements that come along. Can you cover the proffer? I guess in 2008, the original proffer was enough property to do 2 school sites and another public facility, such as a fire station or library, and sort of what the impetus or how you all got to offering only 1 school site and eliminating second school public safety facility. In particular, I'm thinking about a fire station since Stonehouse is so far away from Station 1.
This area here was the former school site in the current plan. Mike will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think roughly 178 acres, gross acreage, I believe. And we have proposed as an alternative to that 2 things. One, a lump sum cash contribution of $800,000 towards school facilities, and an alternative site, which is Track 9, the blue site here, which is approximately 80 acres. So the change in the location was land planning related. We are reducing the number of homes by roughly 1/3 in the project, which is proportionally reducing the school demand, the school impact. It did not, in our view, and I think with concurrence from the county, make sense to have a neighborhood school, a school embedded within the Stonehouse neighborhood, based on that reduction in density. And it would be more accessible to the zone that it would serve if it were external to the master plan community. And this was a good location, we felt, across the street, kind of, sort of, from the existing Stonehouse Elementary School. So that's the location change. Secondly, we felt that reducing the size of the site, in proportion to our impact, to serve the need for a middle school, which we understand is the most pressing need at the moment, and offering $800,000 in cash in addition to that was a comparable trade for the school site that was previously offered, the 178 acres and public use area.
Your comment earlier talked about 130,000 square feet of commercial use, but that's commercial building, correct? As far as Stonehouse Preserve and that's in play?
That's correct. That would be permitted if the easements were accepted within the Stonehouse Preserve only, and it would be limited to A1 business uses.
So if somebody came in with an equestrian facility, or, I'm just asking this for clarification. So if somebody came in with a winery or equestrian facility, the expectation is that they would clear much more than 130,000 square feet, right? I mean, it would be, that's just building itself. Structures is what we're
certainly,
talking
yes.
about,
I'm
so-
sorry, I didn't understand the distinction you were trying to make. Absolutely, the 130,000 square feet limitation is exclusively building area. The warehouse where they would store the grapes, process the wine, tasting room if they had that, restaurant if they if that was something that was desired, barn structures and those things, not the entire footprint of the facility. No.
Right. I wanted to clarify because your presentation led me to believe it was 130,000 feet just of commercial use. So.
No, sir. Sorry. Thank you for the clarification.
What's the access for Stonehouse Preserve? So if conceivably somebody wants to come in, put a winery in, they're going to clear lots of acreage, lots of logging, lots of commercial activity in that respect. So what would you all expect the access to be in and out of Stonehouse?
Well, just so you know, and I'm sure you do, silviculture is permitted on the property now. The property is in timber management now, and logging occurs on a regular basis, not only on this property but on the surrounding timber properties. So nothing would change in that regard, except now, in order to do silviculture, you have to be subject to a best management plan. Are you asking how that would the details of that best management plan, or?
No, just access. So, some of the concerns that I've heard from folks out on Croker and Sycamore is, just the actual width of the road. And so so I was just curious what the traffic pattern would be for trucks, because obviously if you're clearing, that's a lot more intensive than the forestry management.
Well, clear cut, I'm not sure that clearing in preparation for winery would be any different than doing a clear cut in a timber management program. So I think they would be comparable, but to the extent the advantage, I guess, of a winery is that would happen only once, right? You would have a clearing event, and then presumably the grapes would be installed, and there wouldn't be any more silviculture in that area. Whereas now it can happen on a relatively frequent basis depending on the management plan. So if that were to occur, the access to the Stonehouse Preserve has been committed by easement to be, at this point, there's an existing logging road or timber management road, fire road as we used to call them, in this location where it intersects Sycamore Landings Road. and access would have to be here or further down the road. So this is, you can see the frontage areas. We have this amount of frontage on Croker Road, so the access would have to be here or, as you see down here, along Ware Creek Road, or some other access would have to be secured across intervening parcels.
And the only other question I had at the moment, I read reference to a covenants committee, I think, the easements.
I don't recall that. You may be right, but I don't recall that.
I'll read it and we'll come back to it, so that's, I'll find out where I had that. I had it marked somewhere, so.
Some earlier draft language in there about, again, the working document about how the central well waiver would be administered. There was but those details haven't been finalized yet. I don't know if that particular term is anywhere else in the application material.
I'm good, thank you.
Other questions? Thank you very much, Mr. Trent. We have some speaker cards. Mr. Ben Arney.
Mr. Haldeman, if you could open the public hearing on
Thank
both,
you.
I just want to make sure you open it on both of the zoning application cases.
We've got them all listed together.
Okay.
As one, so it would include both the rezonings, Z18, Z19, and master plan number 18.
Okay.
We've got them all listed together.
I thought I had opened it.
Yeah, I think you did too, but before the,
Okay.
for Mr. Tran.
Great. Mr. Arney?
Good evening. My name is Ben Arney, and I'm the president of the association at Stonehouse, or Stonehouse at Mill Pond, for that clarification. The last appearance by a member of our board was May 2nd, 2018, in regard to proposed land density transfers in several land bays in the Stonehouse community. And I would like to highlight a significant change relating to our association that has occurred in this intervening time. Negotiations with the owner, SCP-JTL Stonehouse, resulted in a proposal and agreement concerning land base. Proposal was that our HOA relinquish rights and authority to Land Bay 5 in exchange for free title conveyance of Land Bays 3, 8, and 14 to our association. Approximately 44% of our membership voted on December 19th, 2018, whether or not to accept this proposal. There were 275 votes for and 15 votes no, about 95% acceptance. The final execution of this agreement is dependent upon approval of the master plan agreement, proffer amendment, and rezoning that is before you. Major points and details of these proposals were presented to our board on July 24th and communicated to our community on August 2nd. Comments and questions were requested, none were received. Stonehouse at Mill Pond Homeowners Association fully supports the proposed changes to the master plan agreement, proffer amendment, and rezoning you are reviewing. We encourage you to approve the applications.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Richard Costello, excuse me.
My name is Richard Costello. I live at 10,020 Sycamore Landing Road in James City County. I'm here tonight representing a group of residents that live along Sycamore Landing and Croker Road, and I have a petition I'll give you first, and if everyone that's here that lives along there would stand up. So.
Thank you.
I'm going to give you a little history of me. Some of you know me, some of you don't. I worked at AES Consulting Engineers from 1980 to 2016, and I was president from 1993 to 2015, so I've taken a few years off coming before you all, but I usually stood next to Tim Trant when I was here, or similar people. On with the case, and this is truly just about Stonehouse Preserve. I'll talk about a few other things, and it's really about traffic. We are this group of people, we're neighbors to the largest planned community in the county, and we've known for many years that the over 2,000 acres under discussion tonight have been approved for significant residential and commercial development. From the very first approval of Stonehouse, we have been most comforted by one critical restriction. None of Stonehouse enjoyed any rights to access our narrow, winding, substandard country road, Route 607 called Croker Road and Sycamore Landing Road. They're both 607. It was later split when you did the 911 system into Croker Road became at the landing cutoff, became Sycamore Landing Road, and the road down to the landing became Croker Landing Road. But over the years, since the first approval, Stonehouse has come forward multiple times requesting approval for one change or another, mostly reconfiguring land uses within the property and altering traffic improvements. Tonight, for the first time in decades, we are confronted with a dramatic sea change proposal by Stonehouse. That is the elimination of 1,000 approved homes and allowance for over 2,000 acres of Stonehouse land to access Route 607, Sycamore Landing Road, and Croker Road. If you drive beyond the VDOT facility on Croker Road, you notice that the pavement narrows and turns twisty. All those roads are substandard, especially in width. In fact, as you go by the farm, not a half a mile from where you go by VDOT, that road is less than 18 feet wide. It's 17 and a half feet. If you measure it, it's 17 and a half. It's a narrow road. If you get down to the Sycamore Landing, which will not see very much development, the road is in front of my house is 15 and a half foot wide. Typically 18-foot roads are good for 400 vehicles a day, and 22-foot road is good for 2,000 vehicles a day. Put a lot of traffic on these roads would make them unsafe. With that said, the community is supportive of the 4 lots down at the end in Riverside Preserve, and we're supportive, the people are supportive of the 19 lots in the Stonehouse Preserve. And those will actually add almost 70 to 80% additional traffic on those roads, on Sycamore Landing Road. Sycamore Landing Road is about 400 vehicles a day, and I'm talking a day. The traffic studies were done based on peak hour information. Peak hour, what the traffic is between 7 and 9 and 4 and 6 in the evening, 7 and 9 in the morning. When you're out in rural areas, it's the flow all day that matters. You don't have a peak hour in that. I mean, you do, but it's not significant. It's just all the traffic. So, and our only issue is all the trips that can be generated by the 130,000 square foot of commercial space that can be built on Stonehouse Preserve. That's 3 acres of buildings. And if it was all barns with hay in it, it'd be wonderful. But there's no such restriction. It can be wineries. The winery up in New Kent sits on 2.83 acres, has 30 acres of vineyards, and has tours from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. all day, no morning peak. But it also can have venues, events, conferences, bridal, of 180 people. And that's a 24,000 square foot building. 180 people they can serve. You can go to the website and read all about it, but it's 24,000 square feet. As I said, there's 370 trips down, well, approximately 400 trips on Sycamore Landing, east of Ware Creek, the subdivision Ware Creek, and we'll be adding about another 300 for 19 lots and 19 accessory apartments. That's doubling the traffic on a road that's substandard, narrow, people drive off it all the time. But the community is fine with the 19 lots. The community is fine with the 4 lots. The issue we have is that the 130,000 is not defined, and it can be a lot of traffic. And if that traffic comes and that road has accidents and such, the supervisors will be taking money from Long Hill Road or for some other project and widening Sycamore Landing Road. There was a plan put forward 10 to 15 years ago, I don't remember now, but VDOT had done a plan, and I have to go back and find my spot in here, but they did a plan to widen from the VDOT area, the VDOT office, all the way down to the split, where it was split into Croker Road and Sycamore Landing Road. And they eventually abandoned it because of too many conflicts, too many septic fields, too many wells, too much stuff to move. They just abandoned the plan and it never went anywhere. And the county pushed this, but it was going to be too expensive. Their connection point is now another half-mile south. So we're going to run vehicles down numerous miles of road to get to the entry point of the Stonehouse Preserve. 19 lots is fine, but undefined 130,000 square foot isn't. And that's our concern. That road cannot handle it. As an engineer, there will be accidents. There's accidents now, but it will get a lot worse. There are no shoulders in that road. If you went into Ivydale or Ware Creek Manor, the subdivisions, they look like boulevards compared to Croker Road, the subdivisions. So if you've all driven down there, you know that's correct. With that said, our worry, the community's worry, is the traffic on that road, and it's not defined. The commercial uses are not defined. We have no idea what's coming, how much it will be. But if it fails in the future, it won't be in your lap. It'll be in the Board of Supervisors' lap because they'll have to allocate money to deal with it. And if you have any questions, I'm quite capable of answering questions. I did most of that in my prior performances before these boards.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Mr. Art Michael?
Mr. Chairman and members of the Planning Commission, my name's Art Michelle and I live in Stonehouse Glen. And I'm just coming here to support the rezoning and the preservation area within the rezoned area. So there's two things really that of interest to me. One of them is the preservation and the additional preservation by the rezoning that will occur in the change to the master plan. We have a lot of animals, deer out there in our area, and the thing is they have a tendency right now to be squeezed a little bit more and more. So the idea that we're going to increase that preservation area is going to be much more beneficial to our community. And if the state comes in and decides to purchase that, that'll even be more of a plus, I believe. The second thing that I kind of liked about the master plan is the idea that we're going to try to embed some retail shops within the community that's a training issue right now, if you look at Newtown and other areas around here, and it's very attractive, I think, from our standpoint. So I come here just to kind of support the rezoning and the changes to the master plan, and that's it.
Thank you very much. Mr. Spencer, I think he's left. Those are all the speaker cards I have. If anybody else would like to address the commission on this subject, step forward. Seeing none? Oh, excuse me, I beg your pardon.
Scott Mowry, I live at 10210 Sycamore Landing Road, and I'm literally at the end of the county. I'll echo everything that Mr. Costello said, but we've got different traffic studies and different figures. I will tell you that that road is more than substandard. It doesn't facilitate the current use. It's not up to standards for the boat traffic that goes down to the state park. Sycamore and Landing, I'll give you this photo. This one of our neighbors took it. This is a bus. Not accommodate a full-size pickup truck passing a bus. To get around my daughter's bus, I go through my neighbor's front yard. The bus doesn't have a turnaround. The bus has to turn around on private property. It is a truly dead-end road. So the current use is, we're talking about what needs to be done to improve it or accommodate it, and the additional use, 3%. I hear all these different figures. The road doesn't accommodate the population pressures that have happened with the boat landing. They've improved their facilities down there. You just simply have a guy with a pickup truck and an 18-foot boat, and you're guaranteed that you need to stop in the middle of Sycamore or Croker Road to let them pass because they're not paying attention. So I just wanted to, and the concern is those commercial uses and that access. I think the down zoning is a great idea overall, but the access from Croker Road or Sycamore Landing Road is going to just ignite a problem that's already there.
Thank you very much. Would anybody else care to address the commission on this subject?
How do you do? My name is James Miller. I live at 10031 Sycamore Landing Road. I purchased the property August last year, so just over a year now I've been a resident of this address, and I'm newly married, been married about 2.5 years. And I can tell you my wife got in a car accident on this road just in the past 1.5 years, less than a year, and she almost died. This road, I've had my mirrors hit by other vehicles. I can't tell you how many times I've driven off the road and how many times I've used my horn to alert drivers that they're in the middle of the road, taking their share of the half in the middle. And it's truly disturbing. I can't tell you how many deer I've almost hit. Thankfully, I haven't hit any. I'm sure I will at some point. But the reality of the situation is that there's not enough room for barely 2 pickup trucks to go by each other. My wife times her time. She times herself so that she doesn't hit the school bus driving out, because the school bus thankfully is reliable in its route, and she times it so that she doesn't leave when the school bus is on the road, because when the school bus comes around a corner, and mind you, most of those corners are blind. You can't see around them. So any proper person who lives on this street knows that you hug the corner when you go around a corner. Otherwise, you could have a rude surprise coming at you. So just the reality is that there's not enough space for a considerable amount of traffic. Whether it's a winery, then you have impaired drivers. That's a reality. If you have a special access for venues or events, then where alcohol is allowed and permitted, then you have that to consider as well. And I can tell you, boaters just coming out of the York County, the York River State Park, and they might have a few beers out there. I can't tell you how many times I've almost hit their trailers just because they don't know how to drive on a very tight road. So I'd encourage you just to pay attention to the specific specifications on what is said in the fine details about what is allowed and what is not allowed in those properties out there. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody else?
Good evening. My name is Nancy Bond, and I live at 10124 Sycamore Landing Road. The house that I live in, my brother and I, was built by my father and grandparents in 1948. At that time, Sycamore Landing Road was a dirt road. Over the years, it changed from dirt to gravel to a paved road. It never really got any wider, and the curves were never taken out of it, obviously. At that time, most of the homes on that road were summer cottages. They used to refer to it as Little Richmond because it was basically where people from Richmond spent their summer weekends or summer vacations. Now, almost all of the homes are permanent residents. And as a result of that, we have obviously a lot more traffic on the road, school buses going up and down the road, and we've always had boat trailers on the road. It's always been, as I said, extremely narrow, very curvy. Back in the 50s, a neighbor of ours was actually killed on that road around one of the blind curves. In speaking to some of my neighbors recently about the proposed Stonehouse Preserve and Riverfront Preserve development, one of my neighbors actually told me, she said, "We'll take a look at my car, and you'll notice that the two mirrors on the passenger and driver's side don't match." And that's because she had gotten run off the road by trying to pass a truck and had one of her mirrors knocked off when she hit a mailbox. There's no, as previous speakers have said, there are no shoulders on the road to go through. And the other thing that has probably complicated things recently is that there are some fairly deep ditches on each side, on sides of the road, where they have come along and dug out to try to help the drainage, which has helped. The drainage has been helped, but it also makes you very, very nervous when you're trying to pass a school bus or pass a truck, and you're almost holding your breath that your car, and I drive a small car, that your car won't be pushed over into a ditch and suffer whatever damages might occur to your car as well as to yourself. Over the last couple of days, I have been in touch with a few people from VDOT to just ask some questions about any proposed improvements or any kind of traffic studies that might have been done with regards to the Stonehouse development. And I spoke with Mike Corwin at the, he's a traffic engineer in the Suffolk office, VDOT Suffolk office. He said that I should contact Mr. Glenn Brooks, and he's a local VDOT, in one of the local VDOT offices, and he asked me to speak with a Mr. Rossi Carroll, a residency administrator in the Williamsburg office. So I've spoken to all three of the people just to ask what kind of, had there been any kind of studies done or what their plans are, what is their 6-year plan for Route 607 to see if there was any consideration being given to widening the road or making it perhaps a little bit more safe for additional traffic. None of them really could tell me that anything like that was in the works. They did tell me that there was some proposal for widening between Route 60, I think, and like around the interstate area. Yeah, across where the library is. So there was some proposal for that. But the concern that we have with regards to widening is our house was built in '48. Our septic tank and drain fields are relatively close to the road where it is right now. Any type of widening would impact our septic system. And, you know, I'm sure we're not alone in that regard. I'm sure a lot of our neighbors have similar concerns about any widening of the road that, you know, might take place. So, again, I think all of us, or most of us here probably would be in agreement that limiting the number of homes in the Riverfront Preserve as well as the Stonehouse Preserve is certainly an improvement over what the original plan for developing Stonehouse involved. Our concern is two concerns. One is, while that development is taking place, the amount of traffic that would be required for logging and the construction, when it's like my fellow neighbors have said tonight, it's already unsafe to pass a school bus. I have to pull off into someone's driveway in my small car to let a school bus come by. And then the other concern is the potential commercial use on the Stonehouse Preserve, and what kind of traffic that could impact our already very, very dangerous and curvy road. So we'd ask you to, you know, if there's any way that the commercial traffic could access that property other than through the Sycamore Landing Road, we would be, I think, happy to see any kind of other ways to access that property. So.
Thank you very much. Anybody else care to address or step forward, sir?
My name is John Davidson, and I live at 10016 Sycamore Landing. And I've just got two comments to make about Croker Road and Sycamore Landing Road, and that kind of interfaces what other people have said. The boat landing turnoff is on a slight slope uphill coming to a stop sign, if you understand what I mean. And a lot of people coming up that incline, towing a heavy boat, don't want to come to a stop because of the heavy weight that they're hauling. And it makes their acceleration from a dead stop very slow. And it's also on a blind curve. And so that's something that also adds a significant amount of danger to the existing road that we have. And the other thing that needs to be underscored is that for a commercial use of any properties up there, where like a winery or an equestrian situation, you might well have people coming into the area that are totally unfamiliar with the area, and at least those of us that live here are aware of the dangers of driving on Sycamore Landing Road and Croker Road. So that's another element that should be taken into consideration of the people that are visiting, whether they're impaired or not. It's easy to get in trouble on those two roads. That's it.
Thank you very much. Any other comments?
Ellie Fulton, and I'm a fourth generation Dana. We live at Mount Folly on York River, and we've been there 17 years, and we plan on, we've actually entered the AFD, so we plan on passing the property down to our kids, and hopefully it gets passed down. But just real quick, to beat a dead horse, the only concern we had with our kids learning how to drive was Croker Road and Sycamore Landing. That was it. We knew after having driven a truck at 10 years old on the property and a tractor and a lawnmower, they had a lot more experience when they got their permit to get their license. But Croker Road and Sycamore Landing Road was the only thing that we worried about. And once they got past that, you know, we could breathe. But it was a big concern. So if you take the time, if you haven't been down that road, just take the time and drive down there. It would open your eyes, especially all the way down to the end. So, and you'll see why everyone do it when school lets out or in the morning. That would be good. So that's all. I don't want to take anyone else's time.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Any more comments? Questions? Thank you. Seeing, oh, okay.
Planning Commission, Mark Rinaldi, 10022 Sycamore Landing. I really don't want to be here. I really don't want to be speaking. But I feel on behalf of some of the neighbors who've approached me, there was no posting of the property on Croker Road or Sycamore Landing Road. So many of the neighbors weren't aware until very recently that there was anything going on at all. Some got APO notices. I didn't get one. Many didn't. So some have approached me because they know that I have a little experience with this. So I really don't want to be here, but I feel like I have to. I think there's a couple of things. Most are concerned about the traffic. We've already heard that. There is some issues with the use. When's the last time the state acquired 2,600 acres in James City County? Brook River State Park. Okay. When's the last time Riverview Road or Croker or Sycamore Landing Road were improved to accommodate the traffic from York River State Park? Hasn't happened. So the concern is that if the state were to acquire all or a large portion of it, I heard it said, and I hope that this is correct, that they would be subject to requirements for an SUP for any use that requires an SUP through the zoning. I want to make sure we're all very clear about that is the case. But when the boat ramp went in at the state park and when the pier went in, the pier added traffic substantially. It was a gift from Chesapeake, who owned this property, actually. There was no special use permit for that pier. It just happened. The state built it. And we're very concerned about what the state could do on this property. Aside from that, if you take all the permitted uses, 2,600 acres is a lot of land. If you take all the permitted uses out here and you look at them cumulatively, which I do not believe the traffic study did, I think it looked at a winery, but it didn't look at a winery, a horse facility, a brewery, a distillery, a farmer's market, a nursery, a greenhouse, commercial greenhouse. You go down the list of all the permitted uses that would not require a special use permit. Now you've got a cumulative impact on that road that I don't believe anyone has accounted for. We're all in favor of preservation, whether it's the state, whether it's private property owners, whether it's McMansions. We haven't talked, of course, about other issues about if the state buys it, but that's the biggest issue. I don't believe it's looked at the cumulative impact of traffic on that road through a series of permitted uses by right. And so that's why the group that signed the petition, and there were over 50 of them, despite many of them not even knowing that it was going on, some neighbors were very interested in making sure their neighbors knew what was going on. That's why they said, look, don't fault you for wanting to do with your property, but from the very beginning, that property has all come out to where the roads were designed and were proffered to be improved for it. Now what we're doing is we're shifting for the added flexibility that the owner wants to be able to, do the state, do the private, whatever it happens. Now all the burden gets placed on the county and on its citizens to say, well, what happens in the future with that road? So as one speaker said, it won't fall on your plate to fix it. But it will fall to the supervisors, and there are a lot of roads in this county right now that we need funding to fix, and we don't have it. So I think for most of the neighbors, it comes down to traffic. Land use is an issue, but it comes down to traffic. And so, I think on behalf of the 100 or more families that live on that road or off of that road, really would ask that you put a little more analysis into how that might actually play out and what might actually happen on that road if multiple permitted uses come in by right without an SUP. And does the state have to actually file an SUP for anything it wants to do out there? If they do, that would be comforting. But I'm not convinced that it is the case, and I'm not a lawyer. And Mr. Trant is an exceptional lawyer who I work with, and I'm honored to work with him on many cases. But it's become personal for all these members that live here. We have our little private Idaho out there at the end of the county, and we always knew Stonehouse was there, but it was always over there, and it was always going that way. Now, it's not. So that's what I was asked to kind of share, and I've embellished a little bit, but that's I think what we wanted to convey to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any more comments? Seeing none, close the public hearing. Discussion?
Ask a question of Mr. Halavin to the last speaker's point. If the 2,300 or so acres were protected by easement, would the state have to apply for a special use permit for any non-permitted commercial activity on the land?
If the state is performing commercial activity, they are subject to zoning restrictions in addition to the easement. It's only if the state is using the land for a public state purpose that they're exempt from zoning. They would still be subject to the use restrictions in the easement, though.
The restrictions of the easement.
Other discussion?
I have a question. I'm not sure who should answer this, but in the previous master plan, was access to Sycamore Landing Road part of that plan, or was it not? Maybe Mr. Trent should probably answer
public
that.
public hearings closed.
Existing proffers, Ms. Leverance, and this is a point of clarification, which will probably draw some frustration from those in the audience, but I didn't write them, I inherited them.
Is the current proffers or the previous proffers?
These are the current, the existing proffers, the ones that are binding on the project now, not the proposed proffers. It says there shall be no road connection directly from the property onto Croker Road. There is no prohibition on access to Sycamore Landing Road. It is exclusively a prohibition on a road connection, not even a driveway connection, a road connection to Croker Road. Okay? So I think the prohibition has been somewhat overstated in my professional opinion.
I'd ask a question, Mr. Trent, while you're there. So I did find the reference to the Covenants Committee, and as Mr. Holt said, it's in the draft of the well waiver, or consideration of the request for a waiver. So, so it does reference a Covenants Committee. Will that be in effect? And who is the Covenants Committee? Who appoints it?
I think that's some older language. I don't think that's in the version we're currently working through now.
Okay.
Our preference would be to avoid a covenants committee and to have the covenants binding on and running with the land so that there's no private administration of those covenants, that they are enforceable by the county against the individual.
Okay. And then my second question, I'd asked staff earlier today, and we got a partial answer, and I didn't think of it till later, but from the history of Stonehouse, were there public funds used to put infrastructure in, whether sewer, HRSD, water, those types of things, and what amount and what the expectation was?
I don't know for certain, Mr. O'Connor. I did speak with Mike Etchemendy, who's here as the development manager, and has probably the most extensive knowledge on our team of what public infrastructure planning has gone on since his involvement with the project, which predated the current ownership. And it is our understanding that the facilities that are in place now, the capacity enhancements that have been made, much of which has been private. I'm not to say that there hasn't been public investment, but a substantial portion of that has been private investment, turning it over to the state as development has occurred, but will all be utilized. There is no excess capacity that would result from this downzoning that would not be utilized. So whatever investment is in place, it's our understanding from our development planning standpoint, will be needed and then some to accommodate the residual development and the planned unit development. We haven't overbuilt in a way that would result in some, forfeited capacity through the downzoning.
Applicant be willing to consider finding some way to access the Stonehouse Preserve other than from, for example, asking hypothetically before it goes to the board, consider finding an alternate path, maybe Iron, perhaps.
Trying to get my cursor, I can't do it.
Can I just add on to that? Have there already been considerations for that?
Yes, a couple of things. We have looked at any number of ways to handle access to the Stonehouse Preserve, and it's certainly been our understanding of the concerns that you've heard tonight. It's a balance of public benefits, right? So our interest is in to accomplish a downzoning. There is, a corresponding cost to that. We have tried to minimize that to the extent possible, but through the downzoning, it would sever that, it would change the zoning of the property, it would make it A1, it would limit the density on that property, the development potential forever in perpetuity to 19 homes and 130,000 square feet of A1 of structure uses, business uses. Pretty restrictive. But it never existed. If it had never been rezoned in 1991, it would have remained A1 and would have had much more development potential than we're proposing. So we're downzoning it and then restricting it against what it, the base property right is right across the street on other A1 land. The property is physically constrained in terms of its access. There are only two access points, two areas where the property touches a public road. It's Ware Creek Road and Croker Road. In the areas that
touch the button, the mouse.
There we go. In the areas, thank you. In the areas I was identifying earlier. So the Stonehouse, or the Riverfront Preserve, which is 350 acres up here, would access those 4 home sites, up to 4 home sites. It could be less, but up to 4 home sites. No business activity on that property whatsoever. Would access Sycamore Landing Road at the end of Sycamore Landing Road. Okay. There are a number of undeveloped lots along Sycamore Landing, so there will be other development along Sycamore Landing Road. This is one of the other points. So the rest of the property, the other 2,300 acres, is Stonehouse Preserve. It touches public roads in 3 locations: here at Sycamore Landing Road, here at the transition between Sycamore Landing and Croker Road, and then down here at the connection with Ware Creek and Mount Laurel Road. And so there is no feasible way to accomplish the downzoning of the property, restrict the use to 19 homes, and have an alternative access. It's just infeasible to build a road.
What's wrong with the southern one?
To build a road network to access homes in this end of the preserve, to come all the way across substantial wetland impacts and ravine crossings to get out to Ware Creek Road would be infeasible.
Would there be any possibility of limiting activity for such southern portion? They would not access Sycamore Landing.
No, ma'am, we are not prepared to put at risk the economics of the project in that regard. I mean, the downzoning is a substantial economic concession. And just maybe to offer some comfort, so 130,000 square feet of commercial buildings, there are only a handful of permitted uses, commercial uses, A1 business uses in the A1 zone, and I'll run through them. Accessory buildings and structures, farmers markets that are limited in area to 2,500 square feet or less. If you're more than that, you've got to get a special use permit. Commercial greenhouses, home occupations, a horse and pony farm and a riding stable that we talked about. Notably, horse racing, horse shows require special use permit. House museums, nurseries, off-street parking, which is an odd one. Rest homes for fewer than 15 adults. This is a morbid one, but the butchering of animals for personal use, not commercial purposes, so, farm-related uses. There's a series of agricultural-related uses, presumably, which we would promote. I won't go through them in detail. A limited farm brewery, a limited farm distillery were mentioned. Another one that was mentioned was a winery, including a shop for the retail sale of wine, but not including other commercial accessory uses. So wineries that would have a restaurant or an event venue would require a special use permit. So there's also a backstop to that. There's a commercial SUP trigger in the county zoning ordinance. So even by right uses, if your aggregate square footage, building square footage, commercial building square footage exceeds 10,000 square feet, you will trigger a special use permit. So the short of it is any substantive use, agricultural business use that would occur on this property that would present the increased traffic concerns, which we do not deny, which are legitimate. If you're having a winery that's hosting events, that's a traffic consideration. That's not an impact of this project. That would be the impact of a special use permit that might come someday in the future. May never come, but it would have to come forward as a special use permit. A traffic study would have to be submitted, and traffic impacts would have to be mitigated. And that would be something that this commission and the county is quite competent in my years of experience in administering. It's not an impact of this rezoning.
In addition to the square footage limitations on the commercial SUP, there's some traffic thresholds as well.
100 vehicles in the peak hour of the use, 1,000 vehicle trips per day. So there are a number of safety nets built into the zoning ordinance to address the legitimate concerns that have been raised by the residents. But 19 homes and the very limited by right A1 business activity is not the impact that's presented. It would be those specially permitted impacts.
Questions, discussions?
Well, just a discussion point. I also did go in and look at the permitted and special use permitted uses on the land within that 130,000 square feet. And I do feel that the SUP process would be a mitigator in this. It sounds to me like, this is the current condition of the road is a totally different issue, separate from this case in a sense, and so one that maybe, residents can speak to their supervisors about and so on and so forth to see about how that safety issue gets some increased attention. But as far as the land use case itself, from my standpoint, what I had to balance was the impact on the county, the fact that there's 1,100 fewer residential units going in, that there's a significant number of reduction in groundwater withdrawal associated with the residential units, that the impact on the infrastructure up there is much less than the original master plan for Stonehouse. And so, my one concern is the potential cumulative impact of traffic if a number of permitted uses went in simultaneously, and I would hope that wouldn't be the case. But to me, right now, that this proposal provides a greater benefit to the county when you weigh everything. And the safety net for me is the number of uses, commercial uses that require a special use permit. And then the final deal breaker for me, or the deal sealer for me, I guess I'd say, is the fact that by using easements on that Stonehouse preserve property, the Commonwealth is restricted to, they have to comply with James City County ordinances in a sense. So for those reasons, I plan to support the application.
Could I ask Mr. Halavin a question? Mr. Trent and I had this discussion earlier, and he wasn't quite sure. You can correct me if I misrepresent or misstate, but if the state were to acquire the property, not subject to local land zoning, just if it's a public benefit, we'll have to go with the easement. But does the state have the ability to then condemn the easement if they want to put in a use that the county's not supportive of?
That's a good question. Theoretically, I would say yes, but I don't know off the top of my head what the process is for state condemnation over the locality. Practically speaking, I would say it would be more difficult for them to do that than come to either get the SUP if they needed an SUP to do something, or apply for a change in the easement. But
Mr. Trent, just one quick question. Does your client's desire that the state would acquire both parcels and turn it into a part of the management piece, or just the Stonehouse Preserve?
Just the Stonehouse Preserve.
Further questions?
I will say for me personally, I'm typically supportive, most of you know, of a developer's right to come back and amend the master plan and pursue all those things given changing market conditions and building styles and all those pieces. But on this application, I'm not there yet. I recognize there's some public benefit, but I also recognize there's a lot of unknown in this application. I just think that the applicant has proposed a downzoning and left the door wide open to even unknown uses in the easement, because it says that they are permitted, if we were to change the ordinance, they would be permitted to pursue that. So I think there's a lot of unknowns. I'm disappointed that the county won't receive the originally promised 2 school sites and another public facility. I think for the benefit of the Stonehouse community and the other folks that live out there, I think there's a need for a fire station. In talking to our public safety folks over the years, we don't meet our requirements for the comp plan goals of servicing Stonehouse, and I think a need for a future fire station out there would be paramount. Owners out in that district pay higher insurance rates because they are so distant from Station 1, so it would become a benefit to them as well. And I'm not there yet. I think there's too many unknown uses for that parcel that aren't defined and are not protected by the easement that's there. And my last piece is, we've made decisions as a community over the last 20, 25 years through different comp plans and through different development schemes that have come forward based on the fact that this would be 4,400 homes. And again, I think we recognized that was a place that was going to have density in that portion of the county and would leave rural lands with a little bit less pressure. I feel that when we remove 1,100 units, we're going to put more pressure on rural lands and the interior of the county than we have out here at an interchange with 64. So I'm not there yet. you know, I'll let somebody try to convince me, but then Christ
For me, the Stonehouse downsizing application we have before us is unique for two reasons, I think, if it is approved. And to echo Mr. Kraft's comments, it does eliminate 1,100 residential units that would be represented, an additional of about 3,000 to the county's population count, with all the commensurate impacts on the county's schools, public infrastructure, the environment, traffic congestion, let alone the constant erosion that population growth has on the county's quality of life. The second is an opportunity to continue to protect and improve the natural environment of the county by endorsing the applicant's suggestion of a single buyer for the Stonehouse Reserve parcel of 2,260 acres. This could be accomplished through a conservation easement of the property under the Commonwealth or the VA Outdoor Foundation, who recently placed a conservation easement on 823 acres of Wright Island on the Chickahominy. The connection of these two parcels is that they are rated by the Commonwealth as outstanding and have the highest rating for the environmental qualities. Both the Stonehouse and Wright Island areas were assigned ecological integrity scores that rates the relative contribution of that area to ecosystem services such as wildlife and plant habitat, biodiversity conservation, water resource protection, erosion control, sediment retention, protection from storm and flood damage, crop pollination, and carbon sequestration. As larger, more biologically diverse areas, both are given the highest scores. Part of this score rating is attributed to the uninterrupted corridors that provide for continued habitat diversity. This is something that the population growth and development unfortunately destroyed. And these high eco core areas are recognized by the governor and the DCR, Department of Conservation and Recreation, as part of the vision for conserving Virginia. I asked the Department of Conservation and Recreation's opinion on the impact of future development of 15 units were developed on the Stonehouse Reserve. They stated, the proposed project will cause significant fragmentation of one or more highly significant cores with very high to outstanding ecological integrity. It is the unfragmented natural covers and continuous habitat corridors that are key to its continued biodiversity. This was highlighted also in the Ware Creek Watershed Master Plan of 2016, and recently in the Science Journal study, Connecting Habitats Has Long-Lasting Ecological Benefits, that offered the most compelling evidence yet that connected economic areas flourish. It is for these reasons I would recommend to the Board of Supervisors that they endorse having the Stonehouse Reserve purchased either by the Commonwealth as an addition to the adjacent Ware Creek Wildlife Management Area, or purchased by a conservation agency like the VA Outdoor Foundation or the historic Virginia Land Conservancy. It's one of the many ways we can continue to support efforts to protect and improve the natural environment. And in doing that, the Board of Supervisors could, in fact, petition and send a letter to both the DCR and the governor. It could make it part of its legislative agenda coming up for this year. So those are all avenues that the county could use to try to preserve this really ecologically valuable piece of land that we have with this opportunity to downsize, which is what's being proposed here tonight. Thank you.
If I could ask clarification, Mr. Polster, so that your assumption is that if the state were to acquire this property, then it would not be developed, 15 homes or commercial?
Not at all, exactly, because, and the key to that is the adjacent Ware Creek Reserve. And so what we're doing is extending that entire habitat and preventing it from being fragmented. The Ware Creek Management Reserve is also that Eco Core 5 area that we're talking about. So I think that makes sense in terms of the state, and it would make sense for the county. And the reason that I'm kind of going on this is we're getting ready to go into the next comp plan. And one of the number one things that people are telling us is that we're not doing enough to protect the environment and the quality of life we have here, period. We're not doing it. And so the growth issue is really the piece. And so I'll talk later more about this with the board in the discussion period.
And my understanding is the state approached the applicant first. which is the impetus for all of this in the first place, so that we might make a reasonable assumption that the state is actively interested in purchasing this property.
I just caution everybody,
Say again?
I just caution everybody, there's no contract and there's no commitment from the state. So we are making a decision and a downzoning based on a premise and a promise. And, you know, and that's my concern. You know, we as a community were promised a whole bunch of proffers some years ago. And I think it's really important to understand that the whole reason that there's a downzoning, and Mr. Tran can correct me if I'm wrong, is because, you know, they're trying to preserve the options to them that make it economically feasible. They're trying not to put the investment into the roads and the infrastructure required to develop it and at those 1,100 units. And, you know, this is how they get their return on investment in a time that satisfies their investors and their borrowers. So, again, I'm not there yet. We have this in front of us. If it were a contract in hand with the state, I think we would be having a different, or at least I would be having a different discussion tonight. But because it's not there and we have too many unknowns, that's why I'm not ready to.
Further discussion? May I please have a motion regarding case number Z-18-0002, Z-19-0010, and MP-18-0002 regarding rezoning from PUD to A1 with acceptance of restricted use easements, and for the Stonehouse PUD proffer and master plan amendment, acceptance of voluntary proffers.
I'll make the motion that the Planning Commission approve Z-18-002 and Z-19-0010 and MP-18-002 Stonehouse rezoning and proffer and master plan amendment, with a recommendation that the Board of Supervisors endorse the applicant's suggestion of a single buyer for the Stonehouse Reserve, a parcel of 2,260 acres through a conservation easement of property under the Commonwealth or a conservation agency.
Mr. Holt, would you please call the roll?
Ms. Dowdy?
No.
Ms. Leverins?
Aye.
Mr. Polster?
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor?
No.
Mr. Krupp?
Aye.
And Mr. Haldeman?
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Thank you. We have no Planning Commission considerations this evening. Planning Director's report. Mr. Holt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. I don't have anything additional this evening, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to help.
Some this morning, but I don't anymore. Planning Commission discussions. Ms. Dowdy, you have Board of Supervisors coverage for October the 8th. Any other discussions, or Mr. Polster?
I had one of those Tim O'Connor reflections as we've gone through three of the issues that we went through tonight on the Hillcrest AFD withdrawal, the solar farm, and the issue with the Stonehouse. And before I do that, I want to thank Ms. Ellen Cook so very, very much for all the work that you've done with the staff over the last year and a half. It really was an excellent piece of work, very thorough. So back to the discussion on these three things, is I think we have an opportunity as we go through the comp plan and we look at the scenario planning model to revisit decisions that we've made in the past. And Mr. O'Connor hit on one of the things that I have a problem with, which is putting more pressure on the rural areas that are close to that area. And so I would like to see us relook the EO designation for the Hillcrest Moortown Road as part of the scenario generation project, which is all about growth in terms of what drives it and those impacts that we've been talking, not only on the environment, but the traffic, the cumulative roads, and all the rest of it. I think, at least I got the sensing when the DCR had a chance to look at the solar farm, that the solar farm was a lesser of two evils in terms of the potential development that could happen. It was a better choice. I've had concerns about the retention of the Hillcrest Farm and the AFD, when in fact, what can be, the property hasn't been farmed for 10 years. There's not going to be any development on it. So what is it protecting, especially when there is the opportunity to have it go into the EO zone, automatically kick into the PSA with a master plan, and all of a sudden, we've got a big chunk of rural land between Croker Road, Rochambeau, 60, and Lightfoot. It does nothing for the economy or for the rural character of this thing. So, you know, my plea to you is that we really think about that kind of a long-term view, that we have an opportunity to look at. And to Mr. O'Connor's point about the EO zones that are essentially in the upper end of the county with the Hazelwood properties and the Taylor, we have another opportunity there. If we're going to do some development, what type of development and economic development that we really want to have up there and control that, so that we have the ability to look at the impacts in the cumulative way in one scenario of what growth means for economic development in the upcoming comp. That's it.
Any other consideration or discussions? No, have a motion to adjourn.
So move.
All in favor?
Aye.